Yeah, that's true.
Oh,
Uh,
all right, hold on. I do believe we are coming up to being live right now. I've already turned it live, but I'm not looking at the right monitor as always. I have no idea what's going on.
oh, it's starting.
Good. I'm happy. I'm happy we started. Welcome, everybody, to another Break the Rules stream. I am your host, Lev Polyakov, at LevPo on Twitter, and it is a great pleasure, as always, to be here. We got Giant Geo in the house, we got Tyler Hamilton, and we have the great and powerful Miguel Conner of Aeon Byte Radio joining us, almost as powerful as an actual Archon, if you can believe it,
Uh,
or the Demiurge, whichever one boats your float. So before we get started with this debate, this great debate about the Gnosticism and all that, I
masturbate.
yes, exactly. I want to get to one thing, which is you see on the bottom of the screen over here, we have the super chats, like the top super chats of the month, and we also have King of the Super Chats, or King of the Chat, which is on the left-hand side. If you want to be King of the Chat, then you have to give more than Comfy Lad over here, which is $9.99. The month has just gotten started, so we will see who is going to be King of the Chat. This is my original
Maximum
idea.
overgrift, lad.
Yes, yes, I am grifting like all heaven. So anyway, before we get started, let's do a few bio intros. So Miguel Conner, please tell us a little bit about yourself. You've been in the Gnosticism business for a very long time. You're a prolific writer and speaker, and tell us how you got into Gnosticism to start us off.
Well, like many, it was a spiritual hitchhiking that took many years. Yes, I was born and raised Roman Catholic. I went to Roman Catholic University. In fact, a lot of my arguments tonight will be it's what I learned in Catholic University, the history, the tradition of the church. It's really nothing radical. It's what most scholars knew. I went to St. University of St. Thomas in Houston, Texas, Basilian Order. It was a satellite of Notre Dame, and but I've always been interested. My mom was very ecumenical, so I was very interested in the bigger questions of life, other religions, mythologies. But most religions and mythologies didn't satisfy the big questions. Why are we here? What's the nature of evil? What happens on the other side? And eventually, it was really the Gnostic philosophy that satisfied me. And I just started, as I started learning, I wanted to share with others and started a podcast, started writing books and everything else. But I mean, I will definitely say I don't have a dog in this fight. My wife is Roman Catholic. Kids are being raised Roman Catholic. I think the true Christianity is what works for you, what gets you through the night, as John Lennon said. I can't. I'm not going to judge your path. It's none of my really none of my. It's none of my business. You got to whether you're Mormon, Baptist, Greek Orthodox, whatever it is your journey. Now, obviously, I have differences, and again, a lot of these differences I did learn at Catholic University. The tradition of the church, the history of the church, both Greek and Roman Catholic, are built on fictions, and if you want to believe there's fictions, there's fine. But other than that, and also obviously we talk about the God of the Old Testament and other issues, Paul, John, how they were co-opted. But these are fun things to debate and things that again I have talked to priests many times. So that's basically my journey.
That sounds great. And Tyler, how
All
about
right.
yourself? What is your journey? Let us know.
Well, my journey is kind of the opposite of Miguel's, actually. I was not raised Catholic. I did go to a Catholic school, but as is typical for most Catholic schools in North America, the last thing you learn about is sound catechism or Catholic theology.
Especially in Canada.
Yeah, well,
Especially.
generally what you get is some variations of the golden rule and nonsense. Like, here's why every other religion teaches the exact same thing. It's quite silly, and it probably makes more apostates than anything else. But I did come from that direction. But my coming to God actually had to do with my brother, who had gotten to an accident, which was on a 1% chance to live, was hit so hard by a van that he went headfirst into a stop sign, knocked the stop sign over, pieces of his skull and all that were on the side of the road. The reason that brought me to God was because an off-duty Stars helicopter driver happened to be out for anniversary dinner with his wife, and he was not a believer, but she started freaking out that they had to go and they had to leave that minute. with no reason why. And if there was anybody other than him that drove by and picked him up, he would not have survived just because the virtue of his office of getting a helicopter there that quick. I'm not saying that made me Catholic, but that's what made me start investigating questions of theology and philosophy in the first place, which turned into being a passion of mine when I was a teenager. And then I did study theology academically. That's my background. My formal background is degrees in theology and philosophy as well. I'm also pursuing a doctorate. But I actually started going to a Reformed university, but even back then I was mostly heavily, aside from the Bartinian theology and the like, was into post-liberal Catholic theology, much before the so-called FedCats, as well as usual work with people like Hans Urs von Balthasar, which played a huge role in my development. I was previously actually a Marxist, and it was a bit of a reversal of the typical story. I went to university and got the Marxism beaten out of me. And later on, I converted to Catholicism from there. Most people know me from EBL, which was a philosophy podcast that went through various texts in the history of philosophy and then broke down the relevance for contemporary political analysis. But now what I'm mostly known for is two things. One, which is a show called Theopolitics, which is a theological deconstruction of secular metaphysics throughout modernity and so-called apparently neutral fields of knowledge like political science, economics, political theory, and all these kinds of lovely things. And then putting up a Christian political response in its place. And then the other thing I'm known for, which bridges these two things together, is phenomenology in the embodied cognition tradition, which is our view I hold in the philosophy of mind, is that the mind is not localized to the brain, but neither is it a substance dualism, but rather it's a conglomeration of body, brain, mind, world intersubjectivity that creates what we call consciousness. And I bring those two things together, the work in cognitive science and the theological work in Second Temple Judaism about the theology of the body and resurrection, into one discourse about what it means to be human. So those are the things I'm known for.
Excellent. And I think that there are plenty of things that both you and Miguel can sit down and agree on. I think a lot of things, especially what you mentioned right now about the embodied condition. I think there's a lot of overlaps here. But we're not going to focus on those today. No, instead, I want to get to, as if we were living in ancient Rome, I want to get to the nitty-gritty differences of the Gnostic path, as far as does the Gnostic path lead to the truth, or on the other hand, would pursuing a Gnostic path and not a path that has been traditionally verified through the passing on of knowledge from, master to disciple as you were over a very long church history, that would be more of the correct path, and going otherwise, even if you think that you're going to be free, ends up leading you into folly and ends up leading you into making big spiritual mistakes. So that is my opening, but I'm curious, Miguel, if you would like to go first. What would you see in the pursuit of truth in Gnosticism that would differentiate it from a organized religion like Christianity? And I know that's a very broad statement. We can go all kinds of places from here, but I figure it's a good kind of groundwork to start from.
Yeah, it's a hard question because it's almost irrelevant. I mean, for example, the idea that the Gnostics did not have a tradition and all that would not be real. I mean, Valentinus said he had Theodius, who was a disciple of Paul. With the Gnostic lodges, there were just like the Hermetics, there'd be a hierophant of mystery. And these were taking from the Egyptian mystery. So there was always obviously a tradition passed out. It just happened to be a little bit more anarchist, lodge-based than you would and not even that, because the early bishops, even the mainstream Christians, as I've argued, they really thought themselves as sort of this secret organization, these individuals that were sharing all this information. They never thought of themselves as historians. They were trying to understand these experiences and at the same time take care of their churches during the day. So the only difference, and the idea of gnosis, of course, that direct experience with God, was not like a heretical thing. I mean, Irenaeus talks about the Gnostics have the false gnosis. We've got the real, everybody's saying we got the real dope. Clement of Alexandria talked about the real Christian is the Gnostic. People, since in all parts of early Christianity, of course, wanted to have a deep experience with God and not just rely on faith. I think that the main difference, and this is from Elaine Pagels, She said Orthodox Christianity is like kindergarten and Gnosticism is like grad school. And yes, if you want to make the accusation that the Gnostics were elitist, I think it's a pretty valid accusation. But the truth is they were the ones who really wanted a deeper experience with the divine powers, even a flight to meet God, like the Merkabah Jews and others. And they were really, you might say, the mystery religion part of Christianity in a way. There are those, today it happens. There are those who are fine with life. I'm going to have faith, pay my bills, blah, blah, blah. But there's always those who history who are going to say, no, I need to experience a higher state of consciousness, an expanded state of consciousness, a mystical experience. And that's really what the Gnostics were about in any religion that they happen to manifest itself. It's almost more like a philosophy than anything else. And really one of the first, you might say, proto-Gnostics would be Paul himself. I like the work of David Bentley Hart. He's a devout Greek Orthodox theologian, and he writes how most of us have misconceived Paul of Tarsus. If you take away the pastorals, the forgeries, if you take away your Sunday school lenses, you get a different Paul. And let me quote him. David Bentley Hart says, Paul's actual teachings, however, as taken directly from the Greek of his letters, emphasize neither original guilt nor imputed righteousness. He doesn't believe in either, but rather the overthrow of bad angels. A certain long history of misreadings, especially of the letters to the Romans, has created an impression of Paul's theological concerns so entirely alien to his conceptual world that the real Paul occupies scarcely any place at all in Christian memory. For Paul, the cosmos has been enslaved to death, both by our sin and by the malign governance of those angelic or demonic agencies who reign over earth from the heavens and who hold spirits enthralled below the earth. These angels being the archons, whom Paul calls thrones and powers and dominations and spiritual forces of evil in the high places, are the gods of the nations. In the letter to the Galatians, he even hints that the angel of the Lord who rules over Israel might be one of their number. Whether fallen or mutinous or merely incompetent, these beings stand intractably between us and God, but Christ has conquered them all. In other words, Christ came to vanish these archons and allow us a pathway to experience it with themselves. And the Gnostics, with Paul and also the Gospel of John, where Jesus descends and there's this darkness that he has to come into this world almost hiding so he can open the doorways to his grace, to his power, is really what the Gnostics were about. It was like the mystery religions, it was ecstatic, shamanistic, experiential. So that's what separates it from, let's say, mainstream Catholic, but it doesn't mean it's at odds with early Catholics or mainstream Christians. It was just, there was a debate of how these things were going to play out, how you're going to create a system for these mystical experiences. And the Gnostics and the mainstream Christians obviously had a lot of disagreements, although they did agree again on gnosis, on experiencing this being called Jesus to enter you, and hopefully the Gnostics said you have to resurrect before you die. If you see Christ, you will become Christ, which again is not that different from Paul. The Valentinians, the Sethians really took a lot of their inspiration from Paul, from the Gospel of John. And again, even the Gospel of Mark says, I speak to you in parables, but for the initiates, you get the real mysteries. You get the real experience of the divine. So I hope I haven't gone too much, but I'm just saying, there really isn't that, you might say, conflict, if you would, but there was a lot of arguments, debates, and that's how the church went. And the Gnostics eventually lost that debate and lost their heads, literally.
Yes, indeed. And also, I want to ask everybody who's watching, if you're enjoying this, be sure to subscribe. Now, Tyler, what do you think of what Miguel just said right now regarding the Gnostics? Is there anything that you would want to amend when it comes to the definition of what Gnostic means to you? And I guess this would be a good way to start.
Yeah, good question. So there's some things in what Miguel said that I agree with, other things that I don't. I mean, for the sake of argument, Miguel's saying that Gnosticism, for example, is indeed a tradition. I'll tend to agree with him on that. There is a lot of scholarly dispute, for example, on whether or not Gnosticism is a loosely connected movement or it's something actually more broadly united. But there are various things you could say about Gnosticism if you want to break it down into some points that they all hold in common. Like, for example, a kind of dualism that comes first, which basically means that there's in creation and in man a mix of good and evil that's distinguishable, that these two qualities exist side by side, and there's usually a distinction between what's good and what's largely transcendent, unknowable God, and then the God who created the world. So what you'd call the knowable God in Gnosticism is projection into the creation, is the creator, while the unknowable God is over everything, but is too transcendent to be directly involved with creation. So you have a kind of notion of God where the true God and the creator God of Genesis aren't the same thing. And this is something common in a lot of Gnostic literature where they attempt to de-Judaize it quite largely out of the Old Testament. This is something you find in Marcion and all the like. You also have a certain cosmogony in Gnosticism, which is where in the creation there's a contrast of spheres, often called light versus darkness, soul and or spirit versus matter and or flesh, and knowledge versus ignorance or forgetfulness. So here you have a dualism right into the heart of creation. So on the one hand, you have light, soul, spirit, and knowledge that represent what's good. And on the other hand, you have darkness, matter, flesh, and ignorance or forgetfulness of that turns into reflecting evil. And that plays, of course, into the notion of salvation, which is, as Miguel said, a notion of elites having access to this secret knowledge others don't have. If you want to use Pagel's expression of grad school, I wouldn't quite put it that way, but the idea that is in creation, you have evil from the very start. And so the positive features in man are usually some kind of like a divine spark within them. In a sense, it's largely Neoplatonic, actually. So the cosmogony is also very dualistic. I would actually just describe it as an anti-cosmic dualism. And then you have a notion of salvation and redemption that are primarily in terms of knowledge about this creation's dualistic nature, so to speak. And so there's more things about Gnosticism we could break down in this regard. But so I would agree with that. But now this is where I would put the emphasis quite differently from Miguel on this, is I see actually, and compared to what he says as, you know, wanting to have this direct relation to the divine, to understand this divine secret, to participate in it. This is where I see largely the difference of the radicality of the Christian message versus a lot of other religions which try to achieve this form of Gnosis. Now, it's true that, you know, Paul would say we have the true Gnosis, right? But I mean, that's just simply the same meaning of the word, knowledge. We have the true knowledge of the true God revealed himself to Jesus Christ. But this is where the distinction comes in, is that in Orthodox Christianity, the story we're given here is of one that is very unique, which is a God who enters into history, right? So we have a historical notion of Christ, of a God who intervenes into history directly. He becomes a man and takes on the suffering of the world of those around him so that you may participate as the kingdom of the community of God, which is effectively embodying this kingly reality, as Paul would put it, of the kingdom which is here, but also to come. And this stems out of a certain kind of refutation, or you could say delayed ratification of the hope of Second Temple Judaism, which was a form of bodily resurrection. But it was different, right? In the Pharisaic worldview, what you essentially had was Jewish revolutionaries who hoped for a bodily resurrection of all of their peoples, right? And that would go along with the overthrow of Rome on behalf of their Messiah. And the Sadducees denied that kind of physical resurrection, but you find it in the Maccabees, you find it in the Essenes, you find it in the Qumran community and various other forms. But what you have with Christ is this rather unanticipated notion that Christ himself is the one who resurrects, right? So after the resurrection narratives, you have these stories where these people are hopelessly confused, they're sad, they don't know what's going on, and then all of a sudden they encounter the risen Jesus, and they think, okay, well, here we go. Now, this is something remarkably unanticipated, and it's something that is not favored in the Roman world of mythology either, or these kind of cultic civic notions of mythology that we have, which animated Roman life. In that sense, it was a notion of salvation tied up with shame. Why was it shameful? Because crucifixion, according to both Jews and Romans, was something ultimately shameful. If you were a Jewish revolutionary expecting the Messiah to overthrow Rome, you wouldn't want him to die on the cross. In fact, as we know with Simon Bar Kokhba and various other Jewish revolutionaries, their movements ended after the death of their founder. And on the Roman side of things, well, the God who dies and suffers on the cross is essentially not a God at all. He's a total failure. And so both of them were considered to be shameful, but nonetheless, it appears in a new religious context of a God who suffers into history. So this is where the distinction, I think, between me and Miguel actually comes in quite strongly. It's because I favor a theology which is entirely bodily, because what you have in the participation of the sacraments and the Eucharist and Christ entering into the community, which calls itself the ecclesia, the church, is embodying a truth which is counter to the truth of the world, which makes truth through force, right? That's how the empire defined truth, was by crushing you and giving you what truth was. In this case, Christ is declaring that the suffering of the world is being taken up into him, and that this is the moment of truth. And it's in this new reality, this kingly reality. In other words, what you effectively have in Christianity is what I would generally liken to a kind of paradox, in the sense that it's more material than materialism. So what I mean by that is, by participating in the Eucharist, the Christian community, the ecclesia, you're effectively sanctifying matter back to its original purpose of creation, which is the imago Dei, living according to as it's created by the Creator. So the story that we have is that man sins, that he strays, he loses his purpose, and that we have this suffering in the world, and they become a part of possessed by demons, the influence of sin and the like. So in that sense, I don't see a need for a kind of Gnostic appropriation of this God who's in a sense anti-cosmic, right? What I see is a transfiguration of this world, which is something in Christianity which is quite strong. Like for example, is that what you have is a kind of idea that what is being transformed in Christianity is the material world, right? It's a fleshly religion. And which is very interesting, because critics of Christianity often accuse it of being like otherworldly, like you go to heaven when you die and that's it. That's actually not true. Heaven's an intermediate state. The end, kingdom and earth come together. And so you're supposed to embody that reality. And so when it comes to political questions today, there's no distinction between the spiritual and the political as you find in late modernity, but rather inaugurating a new kingdom which transforms the world around us in love. And that's been the impetus for transformations in Rome after the time of Christianity and all throughout our history, and the work the Catholic Church has engaged in. But as for one quick thing I want to address was on David Bentley Hart. I'm actually quite familiar with David Bentley Hart. He does have this idea of, the archons in the census overthrow of bad angels. But I do think this is not quite as ambiguous as Miguel here presents it, because what we do have several times throughout Paul, there's instances where archons is actually used to designate, and it actually says so, to designate earthly rulers, right? Because that's what the word archon actually means. It refers to earthly rulers. So, and several times, right, throughout Colossians, Corinthians, you find the word archon used there. Same with the word aeon, which goes to apocalyptic imagery at the time. But Paul makes several distinctions where he's actually talking about, this is the overthrow of the bad angels. This here is the overthrow of the earthly rulers. So what David Bentley Hart's getting at is that imputed righteousness and original sin, these are original sin, maybe a little something I'll push aside for now. It's a deeper question. But the kind of substitutionary penal atonement theology that David Bentley Hart actually pushes back on, he's a universalist, actually. He's arguing that what you have in this idea is that when creation falls, man becomes enslaved by these powers, which are spiritual, but at the same time, when you're following these demonic powers, your wills are pulled in different directions, and you start engaging in notions of oppression and the kind of rulers that come out of that, the principalities and powers. So Christ is declaring his lordship over the principalities and powers, right? This is why it's called the Son of God. It's not just a Trinitarian point. It's actually the point that he's declaring, okay, the cult of Caesar, you're the Son of God. Well, I'm the real Son of God. I'm higher than you.
Wait, I want to clear something up. When you said the names of the archons related to the earthly rulers, and now you're talking about demonic influences, is there a distinction then between those two? I just want to make sure.
Yeah, well, they're often, the word simply means rulers, and they're often used throughout Paul in both ways, which is something, and he actually clarifies, right? Like he says, like, for example, in like Romans 3:13, right? He uses like aeon in a very plain and temporal sense. In the heavenly realms in Ephesians 3:9-10, he actually uses archon specifically in the sense of heavenly realms, but you could say Corinthians 2 as well, and Romans 13. Another example is Colossians 2:15, where he actually has a specific modifier that uses the phrase powers and authorities in Colossians 1:16 and 2:10 to designate powers that include the supernatural, but also have an impact on the principalities and powers of the world. So you have often a sliding between the two, but that's because they're a part of the same thing. They're a part of a reality that when creation becomes bound to principalities and powers, the demonic, then they also reflect the kind of truth-making machine that's against God, which is, in this case, the might of Rome.
And I want to get to Miguel unless there are any last thoughts. Let me know. All right, I'm going to get to Miguel then. So, Miguel, that's a lot of information right there. I don't know which you would like to pick and go with. One of the things that struck out to me was the question of transformation. Which transformation is closer to the truth, as far as this reuniting with the earth, or whatever you may think is much more truthful? And that's pretty much what I'm after here. I'm after the truth. I want to find out what is the most truthful and how do we know it's the most truthful. So let's go from there.
Truth will set you free, man.
Exactly.
I don't know if it will set me free, but it will set... It depends. No, I don't know about the earth. I mean, as far as I'm concerned, I agree with the Gnostic. This world is hell. Or Origen, he's the church father, said this is the highest level of hell. We're kind of in the golf course, all four of us and those in the chat room. You know, we're the 1% of the world. We're the ones who use technology built by slave labor, and we live so well. But this world is it's hell, and whether it gets redeemed or not, I know I can help redeem others, and that's the best I can do. Again, I don't think Paul, you could say, is a Gnostic, but he certainly was part of the vibe of those times. If you include the Book of Enoch, what was going in Judaism, there was the idea of a vast world of angels was starting to become popular. I mean, you have to, the Book of Daniel, there's one scene when I think Gabriel comes and Daniel's like, hey, well, you're late. And he was like, well, I was fighting the Prince of Persia. And of course, he's talking about the Archon of Persia. And he's not talking about like, the Donnie Darko guy in the movie. He's talking, there's a being that controls Persia, and these angels are kind of fighting. That's what these angels do. They lose control. I mean, Paul's always talking about, that these angels have really screwed things up. But he created more or less the furniture that later would become what you would call classical Gnosticism. Obviously, Marcion really liked Paul, but I don't think I would call Marcion a Gnostic, but that's another debate. I think we have to put him separately. The thing is, what Tyler says, it's sound theology. I think it's inspirational, but I think all religions have something to offer. I mean, my quibble would be, we're talking about what Jesus said, but we don't really know what Jesus said. And again, this is what I learned in Catholic University. Paul is the first one to be writing letters. He's out there. Again, if you take the pastorals out and everything else, it looks like a mystery religion of sorts. And sometimes it's hard to understand what Paul is saying because he can be all over the place. But the truth is, you get a generation before you get the Gospels. The Gospels aren't named except by Irenaeus at the end of the 2nd century. They're anonymous. And this is, again, the same Irenaeus who said Jesus was 55. I'm just going back to my point that the bishops were not historians. That was not their intent. They were really trying to draw from a tradition and create a theology for their churches, just as the Gnostics were trying to create something for their lodges here and there. I mean, I like the work of David Brackey in his book, The Gnostics. He talks about there's three sort of theories. One is a theory that the church came and the apostles were, and they handed stuff, and then the church, Clement of Rome and all that. But that, unfortunately, that's more of a fiction. It's not historically sound in any way, shape, or other, and I can go into the reason. The other one is the horse race theory, which right out of the bat, you had the Gnostics and the Catholics and the Marcionites and the Donatists, and everybody's just sort of galloping toward history, trying to see who's the first one that Rome will like or something like that. That is obviously not true. The third one is probably the best one, which David Brecht calls the theory of hybridity, where you had this, you might say, atom bomb, something happened. Oh my God, we're hearing about Jesus. People are having experiences. People are having visions. They're talking in voices. What is going on in Palestine? And it starts spreading. And what you have these communities who are latching on to different figures. Some, think, back then there was no internet. You were lucky if your community had one scroll. You might have, the Gospel of Matthew. Somebody else might have the letters of Paul. The other one might have the Gospel of Mary Magdalene. So you have these communities trying to figure out, and they're interacting. And through hybridity, they're borrowing things from each other. They're tweaking their own ideas, and they're growing. But all these communities are growing in this principle of hybridity, and they're all sort of going into the 2nd century, having dialogues with each other, having arguments, sometimes polemics, and sometimes borrowing each other or copying each other's letters and notes and trying to figure out. Bishops are sending letters. The Gnostics are also creating their mystery religions, and they're sort of adopting and latching themselves up to other religions. For the record, I would say that Gnosticism really began, and this is a theory with scholars like April DeConnick and John Turner. Probably most likely they were dissatisfied Jews, Hellenistic Jews, who were done with the Second Temple, done with the Roman corruption. They were done, and they decided, like the Essenes and the Dead Sea Scrolls, they were going to go into a very aesthetic, mystical sort of life. Many of them came into Egypt, into Alexandria. They started interacting with Egyptian priests who started teaching them the ancient Egyptian mysteries that were starting to die off because of the Greco-Roman world. And they began really adopting this Egyptian mysteries, which taught them astral flights, altered states of consciousness, all that was still. And then at the same time doing big time exegeses on the Old Testament to figure out, or the Hebrew Bible, to figure, like Paul trying to, Paul says in Galatians that it was angels who gave Moses the Torah. So Paul's already hinting that this whole universe is kind of ruled by deficient beings. We're possibly trapped in a simulation and all that. So that's my only points I would say on all of that is, again, we don't, history is about demonstrating things. You can't prove anything in history until you get a TARDIS. But I think it's pretty sound to say that the history that we're given about the church and Christianity is not sound, and we really don't know what truly happened in those days. It's like Albert Schweitzer said in his book, The Quest of the Historical Jesus. The Jesus we look for is the Jesus we need. Or what did William Blake say famously? I have the note here. He says, both read the Bible day and night. While you read black, I read white. So
very interesting. And also, I want to not forget, everybody, buy Voices of Gnosticism by Miguel Conner. Here is the book right in front of me. I look forward to reading it, and I'm going to put the Amazon link in the chat as well. So going to Tyler, and then I want to definitely hear from Gio as well on this subject. Going to Tyler, there's two things that really struck me what Miguel said, one of them being that we don't really know because of the way that history is. That's the first thing. And the second thing would be, just as a practical example, let's say you're one of these people who decided back then to go out into the desert and to get some revelations eventually from your meditative experiences that led you to the conclusion that Miguel just talked about right now, specifically the conclusion having to do with the archons and all of these things that are attributable to most Gnostic sects. What, in your opinion, would happen to those people after they pass on? So those would be the two big questions for me. Other than that, you're free to go in whichever direction you would like. And then I would love to hear from Gio.
Well,
Yes?
we did have those, the Desert Fathers, who were very conservative Christians, but are in the desert, and they were far more anti-cosmic than the Gnostics could ever be. The Gnostics paid their taxes, and they went to universities, But the Desert Fathers, they were really OG. They were hardcore.
Oh, also, Tyler, how would you respond to Miguel's point about St. Paul sort of making space, let's say, for the sort of archonic rule of the earth, but also the bifurcation between, that anti-cosmic system?
Well, again, I already addressed that. Okay, first thing I'll say, though, is there's actually a lot in what Miguel said that I'm going to have to address separately. Things like the anonymity of the Gospels, a form of what's basically the Bauer thesis, by the way, that early Christianity was diverse and that there was all these different people reacting to what they saw, and that what we call the Orthodox is something that ascends later and becomes ascended in the 4th century. So there's a lot of things in here to respond to. So I'll take them all by turn, if you don't mind. But as for the ark in question, as I said, Paul uses the term interchangeably and several times because he's trying to allude to the fact that when creation and man turns away from God and turns away towards sin, and he becomes prey to the powers which are spiritual, but those spiritual powers have rulership over the principalities and powers of the world, the rulers, the Roman imperial truth-making machine, which is why Christ's death and resurrection is he dies by weakness, right? He dies by the power of truth alone when he brings himself to be crucified and then resurrects over it, right? He resurrects over the truth-making machine by surviving, right? Post-mortem existence. It was another version of fulfillment to the covenant of Israel. So that's where that comes from. I don't really see a conflict between that or anything specifically Gnostic about Paul's use of archons. It's like the same thing, like people in the chat saying the word gnosis. Paul uses it several times. That doesn't mean much. It's a Greek word. He uses it something else, right? But a way I'd push back on that as well is that Paul is remarkably non-silent about Jesus. I mean, this is kind of like the Earl de Hardy Jesus puzzle thesis, the idea of a
good book.
Yeah, I disagree. But
of course, it's still
I do think it's more respectable, though, than other mythicist attempts. I will give it that.
Yeah, there's some crazy ones out there.
But as for like the non-silence of Paul refers to historical Jesus many times. Like he says that Jesus is born in human fashion as a Jew and had a ministry to Jews in Galatians 4:4. Jesus referred to as Son of God. Again, that's a title over Rome, but just as much as it is being Trinitarian. In 1 Corinthians 1:9, Jesus was a direct descendant of King David. Romans 1:3, Jesus prayed to God using the term Abba. Galatians 4:6, Jesus especially forbid divorce. 1 Corinthians 7:10, he taught that preachers should be prayed for their preaching. 1 Corinthians 9:4, Jesus taught about the end times. And 1 Thessalonians 4:15, he also refers to the name Peter, Cephas rock, which Jesus gives to him in 1 Corinthians 3:22. Galatians 1:19, Jesus has a brother named James, and I could go on for quite a bit longer. But another important point about Paul, I would say, is that Paul also has a very Trinitarian theology, right there very early. And so one way you see this is the way in which Paul restates the Shema prayer of Israel, right? So that version, which you find in the Septuagint version of Deuteronomy 6:4, this is something that Jews across the diaspora would say day by day, which is Akue Israel, Kairos ha thes hemon, Kairos estin, which basically means that you shall love your God with all your heart, with all your psyche, and all your power. That's the way the prayer goes on. So what Paul does is he actually takes this prayer and he discovers the historical Jesus in it and he adds it to that prayer. He goes, there's one God, the Father, from whom are all things, and we to him, and one Lord, Jesus the Messiah, through whom are all things, and we through him. And so there's no verbs in the original formula, but Paul and his hearers wouldn't actually need to hear them, right? They would understand it to read that there's one God, the Father, from whom are all things, and we are to him, and one Lord, Jesus the Messiah, through whom are all things, and we are through him. The point Paul is making is that this Trinitarian theology isn't just a point about the Trinity. It's actually a point about the unity. He's saying to them, like, look, if you guys are trying to have this distinction between the Judaic community and the Gentile community, but we have a Trinitarian Jesus who's identified with God, who all throughout the Gospels actually explicitly violated social purity rules. Like, for example, the lepers hanging out with tax collectors. This is the same thing you see in Galatians, by the way. People often mistake that there's some kind of dispute between Peter and Paul that's theological. It's not. It's that Peter was going back on his following of Jesus once the Judaizers came into the picture, and he goes, okay, well, these are social purity rules which Jesus actually violated himself. And this is where Paul gets the impetus that, if you want to follow the rule of our Lord, you got to end that this is essentially a covenant once it's been established, comes along for all people. And so we need to break these social boundaries. Right? And this is something that Paul picks up several other places as well. In fact, Paul violates Roman norms of belonging to your social caste at several times. This isn't the same message. Like there's no Jew or Greek woman or female, whatever. So yeah, that's what I would say about Paul in this picture. Now, but there's several things about the historical Jesus I I would like to address. But do you want to say anything before I go on any of those?
No, I think Miguel's good.
Yeah, I'm
All
good.
right,
Yeah,
yeah.
and I should. I mean, yeah, I don't think. Again, I want to stress, Paul was not a Gnostic, but he certainly was doing his thing. He definitely saw creation as good, but the Gnostics certainly borrowed a lot from his ideas. Just like Philo of Alexandria, all these figures were laying the groundwork for Christianity going on in the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd century.
Sorry, did you say who borrowed from Philo? I missed that.
Philo of Alexandria. I'm saying there were these
The
thinkers
Gnostics,
like
you gotta
Paul, Philo. They really offered a lot of the furniture. I mean, that Josephus is another one. Luke heavily borrows from Josephus, but these figures, you might say, set up the furniture that would be the nascent Christian church.
Well, I mean,
And
as for Philo, he most likely would have died around the time of Christ. The vision that Philo puts forth comes from wisdom theology, and also his Greek Neoplatonism, which actually is not quite in line with the Orthodox Christian view. But Philo actually...
Well, Middle Platonism. Yeah, Neoplatonism hadn't come around.
If we follow him, his view of the Trinity is more like, I don't even know what you call it, like binitarianism or something. Like that there's God, there's wisdom, which is identified with it. But as I said, the association of Christ and the founding of the Trinity is something we find largely from like the Matthean baptismal formula, for example. We find it in Paul invoking the Shema prayer and putting God in there. We find it in Jesus' own proclamations. I'm not sure where Luke gets from Josephus, though. But...
Oh, a lot of the historical, for example, in Acts and so forth, it's straight out of Josephus. I mean, we don't have it anywhere else, but we know Josephus is before. So, but that's a side argument. Yeah, and as far as the Trinity, I don't know why people get so hung up on the Trinity. It's like the most.
But I do want to ask you a question.
It is kind of important.
And I understand. I forgot what Paul Tillich said. The Bible doesn't offer any philosophical issues, but it demands philosophical answers. So that's where you get the Trinity, all this stuff that would be pretty alien to the first Christians, and it seems very complicated. But the Trinity issue that's something else that.
Well, I don't see it as alien because, like I said, Paul has that. You also find,
but they don't. None of them explains it. You're getting little snacks here and there, and it's not necessary. The church doesn't need the Bible to come up with theology. It's helpful. It's as long as they got something, the current
right. But that's a part of like the pre-Christological Haim and Paul that Paul cites. Like these are early witnesses to an idea of Trinity. Yeah, you're right. It's not fully developed until later. But like even Justin Martyr, for example, who's largely Platonic, he still holds to a bodily view of resurrection and a version of the Trinity, right? But I do want to ask too, though, because I got on Peter borrowing from Josephus. I do. What do you? But like for example, Luke. Yeah, Luke and Acts. Luke wrote Luke and Gospel according to Luke and Acts. There's things that Luke gets right that Tacitus and Josephus get wrong. Like for example, the expelling of the Jews by Claudius. We only find that confirmed in Suetonius and also as well as other archaeological evidence, but we don't have it in Josephus anywhere.
Yeah, I mean, Josephus is not always reliable. He's also writing propaganda too for the emperor.
He did engage in that, yeah. But anyway, so I do want to talk about this anonymous gospel, but I don't actually buy this whatsoever for quite a few reasons. One is that we don't actually have any anonymous copies of Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John. None have been found. But as far as we know, actually, they never really existed. But ancient manuscripts that we have are basically unanimous in attributing these books to the apostles and their companions. And so the reason this is significant is that when we try to determine, when we're studying the New Testament manuscripts, this is basically just textual criticism, is that you go back to the earliest and the best Greek copies to see what they actually say. And so when it comes back to the titles of the Gospels, not only the earliest and the best manuscripts, but all the ancient manuscripts, without exception, in every single language we have, attribute them to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. But there's more reasons I would say we should actually trust those, right? One, partly because we don't have the wide variety of titles. The only significant differences we have is that in some later copies, the word gospel is missing because they abbreviate the title. But precisely the names of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are found in every single manuscript that we possess. So if we're following the basic rules of textual criticism, then these are the names of the authors, right? So they're as original as any part of the Gospels, for which we have unanimous manuscript evidence. And so another thing I would note about that is that these titles are present in most ancient copies of each gospel that we possess, including the earliest fragments and the papyri. So, for example, if you take the earliest Greek manuscript of the Gospel of Matthew, which is Papyrus 4, you have the title A Gospel According to Matthew. The oldest Greek copy at the beginning of Gospel Mark starts with the title The Gospel According to Mark. And then they also have the manuscript Codex Sinaiticus, which was discovered on Mount Sinai. It's basically one of our most reliable copies of the New Testament ever found. And again, Papyrus 75 with Luke. So, and the earliest manuscript of the Gospel of John has it as well. So they all unanimously attribute it. But there's even further reasons I'd put that out there, right? Because the authors, they don't name themselves in their texts, but this applies very well to every other ancient document, such as Tacitus's Annals. Authorial attributions in ancient texts, they're not found in the text, but they're found in the title. So like one work which is influential on me is Texts and Transmissions, which is not about the New Testament. It's actually about other ancient works. And when you look at the classic works from around the time of the New Testament, whose authorship and date nobody questions, they're recorded as having, say, the earliest copy between the 5th and 9th century, and that we have the earliest attributions at the same period, say, if, like, for example, Celsus De Medicina, which is attested no earlier than 990 AD, and then not again until 1300. And so if we took these and we applied the same principle of anonymity to them to say, okay, well, the Gospels are anonymous, antiquity itself would basically be just like a blank wall, right? And the other thing is that no lack of text on the name actually automatically means anonymous authorship anyway. So we had this prior to publishing and just before the Codex, which, by the way, Christians, when it comes to the Codex, this is like the first time the church has ever been ahead of the curve technologically, was the use of the Codex. But there was no way to discern what was inside of a scroll and differentiate it from other scrolls other than like trying to guess based on the external experience and if you've seen it before. So if the Gospels were written, they wouldn't be left unauthorized or unidentified without no other practical reasons, other than a title descriptor, if it was intended to be read by, say, one person or a small group of people. And so if we take that the Gospels are read for a wide audience, and a lot of their writing looks that way, they're read liturgically, they're read out loud to the community, it's part of the community, canon forms community, then you have to explain why these practical factors would be irrelevant and allow a gospel to remain anonymous and then not later attributed to multiple authors, right? So you might have a case if you said that we could find a copy of Matthew that is attributed to, say, Andrew, or a copy of what is basically Mark attributed to Barnabas, but the titles are unanimous, they're unequivocal, there's no variation in them whatsoever. And the other point is on the names that they chose. I mean, if you're trying to give these gospels some authority, you wouldn't pick Luke, for example, who is very obscure. You wouldn't pick Mark, who abandoned Paul. And you wouldn't pick Matthew, who's also a tax collector, right? The only one that might make sense is John, if you're saying he could maybe be a pseudonymous author. I don't really think he is. But so on top of that, 2nd century testimony, the fathers, they all unanimously attribute it to the people that carry their name. And it shows that they receive their titles early on. So it's part of the issue then is if we have to say that they're anonymous, we have to have the question is, how would these circulate anonymously for 60 years and someone finally put author's name on them and then get them across the whole church of the Roman Empire to agree? Or you also have the problem is if you're an anonymous author to pen the gospel and you want it to be accepted, you would have to require first to produce the gospel, then you'd have to present it as the work of somebody else. Then you would have to concoct some story about how that came into your possession. You have to get around the problem of why that person disappeared or was previously unknown. And then once you get to the church at large and then spread it throughout the Roman Empire and try to get these people to accept it as genuine, in which case I don't think any demand for anonymity actually works.
Wow. That was very interesting, Tyler. I would love to hear from Miguel. And also just want to keep in mind that after we talk about the historical aspects of Christianity, I would want to get back to more of the philosophy, more of why would you put your hat in the ring of one versus the other as far as what you expect to happen to the world as well as to yourself, your essence, after you pass on. But Miguel, please let me know what you think of Tyler's comments. And also, everybody subscribe. I'm doing the impression of the kids.
Yes, please, Keith Woods, come on BTR. My God, we need you. That's,
Well, he's not gonna come because of you know who.
Hi, Keith.
I don't know, but
One bud.
yeah, even Tyler called him out. There you go.
I have to. We're in the chat. Miguel, you going to give it a turn? You want to call out Keith?
Yeah. Interesting arguments. I don't think I would buy them. I mean, the Gospel of John, the earliest fragment, the P52, that's 2nd century. The other Gospels are later. We don't know if Matthew is referring to the tax collector. I mean, yeah, we could go back and forth all night, but again, there's this big hole in the 1st century. Gospel of John, maybe. I mean, we have to keep in mind that the first people to write commentary on the Gospel of John were the Gnostics. Heraclon is writing, then it gets appropriated. We have to keep in mind also, I mean, Tertullian did not like Paul. He called him the apostle to the Gnostics and Marcion. So, I mean, again, we have a big shift. I mean, it's a big shift. I don't know if you guys have listened to the great podcast Born in the 2nd Century by Chris Palermo, who's a devout Catholic. And he every week he comes up with argument as a Catholic that Christianity did not start until the 2nd century. I think it just, there's too many holes in it. And again, what I'm saying is not radical. This is what I was taught in Catholic University by priests. This was what I was taught by scholars. There's nothing wrong. If you want to lean on faith and tradition, rock on. Tradition's great. Tradition is when the people make a difference in a religion and get like the Marian Ascension. Tradition, kind of, the church had to listen to these people. I mean, but yeah, I wouldn't say there's just right now too much that I would. Too many say that we know that they were probably written after Jesus was dead, and we know that none of the apostles, these people, were probably around when they wrote them. There's just too many questions, too many holes as far as I'm concerned.
Before going away from that, I want to ask Tyler, do you agree with what Miguel said as far as it being historically established that these disciples were not around when all of these were written?
No, they are from the apostolic age. I mean, like, interesting thing is the earliest, we used to say like 60 to 70, for example, for a lot of them. That's kind of the standard date. But we actually recently found a fragment of the Gospel of Mark from the 50s. And there's even a lot of scholarship, not even Christian, trying to put it as back of the 30s. This is something quite new, but it is widely affirmed that the canonical Gospels, which were considered authoritative throughout the early church and the early intrinsic designation of the canon, which goes all the way back to even the Didache at the end of the 1st century. So this is something I can get into quite a bit more, but the historical reliability of the Gospels, I think, is pretty well established.
Well, what is the one that you mentioned right now, the one you said just came out, that would prove you correct?
I'm not saying that one proves me correct. I'm saying the most recent thesis coming out is that the Gospel of Mark is actually even earlier. It's the 30s. To me, that's way too early. But my point is that these are generally written 20 years after. That's after the time of Jesus. That's the normal consensus about them. And
Tyler. Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
I was going to say, well, there's a bigger question here about like what they actually say, whether we can rely on the text given the manuscripts that we actually have. It can reliably produce the transmission of them. And whether or not they, deal with all the variants and the like, if we can produce the original words of the text, that's another question that could get into. But
before that question, I know I'm being a stickler here for this original point, but that's because I don't want this to be like CNN, where people say something and then move on. I actually want to at least pick something up, something juicy, and try to focus on it. So what you said right now, where can we go to find this out, as far as this? Being absolutely the case that these were at around the time that you say they were, Tyler?
Well, where do you go to find it? That's just the standard approach in scholarship. Maybe it isn't now on the internet, but it is a standard approach to scholarship.
No, but Miguel disagrees with you. So what is it that you would say?
I haven't heard of this text 30. I haven't heard of it, so I don't know.
Well, you disagree, Tyler, that it's in the 30s as well. So why would you give legitimacy to that particular text interpretation?
Well, I'm not sure why we're going on this tangent. My point is that they're commonly dated to 20 years after the time of Christ. The earliest manuscript that we have now, which was only recently discovered just a couple of years ago, it's dated to the late, I think, AD 56 actually. Right now, it's not cataloged yet because it hasn't been sufficiently gone through. But this is what is newly coming out. Right, we have cataloged 5,600 manuscripts of the New Testament in Greek alone. right? So this is just one new thing that's coming out. What I said is that the conservative estimate for the dates of the Gospels is 20 years after.
Well, what has been cataloged? So if you're talking about something that hasn't, let's leave that to the side because we can't do anything with it.
What has
been? Well, no. Before,
100 manuscripts have been cataloged, and that's in Greek alone. That's not including.
Okay, copies. Can we pick one so that you could show this to Miguel, so Miguel will change his mind about where he dates these?
Well, I mean, you don't need to pick specifically one. I mean, there's two questions in here. One is on the textual transmission, if the variants that we have produce a reliable picture in which we can reconstruct the original Gospels, because we don't have, say, actually text from 20 years later. They're dated to 20 years later. And they're done that partly because of intertextual reasons, right? Like there's the lack of anachronism, for example, that if it was written later. So there's various clues about where they would be. But as for textual transmission, this is a case of how we have textual variants. And so we reconstruct that on the basis of textual criticism. And so, again, we have an embarrassment of riches. Compare that to most other texts of the time. We have like maybe 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 of ancient literature. In the case of Christianity, we have an embarrassment of riches. But we do have enough to actually reconstruct the original Gospels, even if you didn't have any of the 5,600 manuscripts or the other 5,000, which aren't, not 5,000, 500, which aren't actually constructed yet. What you do, you could actually reconstruct the entire thing just out of the sayings of the Church Fathers itself.
All right, before we move on, Miguel, would there be anything you would want to ask?
Wait, can I interject with
one right after this, Geo? Would there be anything that you would want to ask? Geo-harassment, hashtag geo-harassment. Would there be anything you would want to ask Tyler if you would like Tyler to convince you of the specific of these dates that he's talking about here? What would it take, Miguel, for you to change your mind about these dates? What would you have to see in order for that to happen? And what you're not seeing right now?
Just the evidence. I mean, even most mainstream scholars would put Mark at around 70 AD because he's obviously when Jesus is doing his little apocalypse, he's talking about the Roman destruction of the temple. And there's other hints. Mark makes a lot of mistakes. He obviously was not from Judea. And yes, he was tradition. He's Peter's whatever translator or Frank. But there's definitely a lot of even anachronisms that you can see. I mean, the word, for example, the word synagogue, most people in the times of Jesus didn't use the word synagogue because everything was still around the temple. I mean, but yeah, we can go back and forth, but I think it's my only point before, we go back and forth all night is that whoever wrote these Gospels mainstream, including Catholic scholars, Bart Ehrman, it would put the earliest at 70. That still puts Paul as the only person close to Jesus. And then, the whole idea of what Paul's saying, again, David Bentley Hart, Tyler mentioned Earl Doherty, whose book I like, but you can make an argument on the other way that Paul was talking about a historical Jesus. I think he was talking about an alien being, a spirit, the logos, some hypostasis of the divine.
Well, then, before Geo, Tyler, any last thoughts on that matter? And then we could put it to rest.
Right. Even if, for example, we accept that off. Well, first of all, the synagogue notion. I mean, the word synagogue back then simply referred to a body of believers. Now, when it comes to some of the other points mentioned there, again, on the anonymity question, I answered that with detailed argument. I didn't just say scholars say one thing. I gave reasons why they say that, right? And I didn't hear an answer for that yet. And as for the celestial Jesus of Earl Doherty, aside from what I said before, Paul is not silent whatsoever about the historical Jesus. We don't actually have any surviving so-called celestial Jesus believers in any of the record. Now, this is another thing I could get into, which is on the geography of heresy, essentially. Is that what we have in every place that we look to the early church is that heretics come later. They're dependent on the canonical Gospels and dependent on what we call the proto-Orthodox community. But another thing I would say about, for example, the reliability of the Gospels, even the Gnostic Gospels, for example, like the Gospel of Thomas, even in their composition, they assume the priority of the canonical Gospels. Right? That's where they derive the material from. So there is a recognition of apostolic tradition along that we can trace what was called the rule of faith by people like Clement and all that. So there's just so many things to go into here, but I haven't quite seen a convincing reason.
I do have a Clement question. Yes.
What I wanted to add is, of course, what these Gospels looked by, and when heresy came about, or when Gnosticism, for example, in the earlier versions of the Gospel of John, when Jesus goes to the Pharisees and he says, "You are of your father, the devil." The earlier versions actually say, "You are of your father, the father of the devil." So the early versions of the Gospel of John already lean much more Gnostic. Paul, again, leans pretty Gnostic. And as far as heresy, the smoking gun, which I never understood, is Irenaeus and many of the church fathers explicitly say the source of Gnosticism is Simon Magus. He's the father of all heresy. He is the fountainhead of Gnosticism. Now, never mind that the Ebionites and others thought that Paul and Simon Magus were the same person. Basically, Simon Magus was Paul in drag or something. He had a beard. But it's very well recorded that Simon Magus is like the arch villain of the church. Well, the problem when they do this is that in Acts of the Apostles, Philip meets Simon Magus, and Simon is doing all this magic. He seems to be part of the Christian, group or magic Hogsworth or whatever. Yeah, he goes, and in this story, he meets Peter. He gets in trouble because he's trying to bind the Holy Spirit. But what the church is saying is that Simon Magus is a contemporary of Jesus. So the idea that heretics came later is not, because Simon Magus was there, accepted, and then according to the church fell out of grace. Obviously, there are other stories of Simon Magus, church tradition, the pseudo-Clementine. You have all these stories. Peter and Simon have a magical battle. Simon loses. We do have history of Simon being the successor of John the Baptist. When John the Baptist is killed, Simon Magus is the one who takes over and continues the ministry of John the Baptist. So I just wanted to bring that. It's not as cut and dry as we'd like to think. There's many streams to this, and they're all fascinating. But I don't think there's again, my argument, there's not a bang, bang, this is how it happened. And again, this is something that most Roman Catholic scholars would agree with me.
Well, I don't actually know any that do. But
let's get to Geo.
Volumes on this, but again, like a lot of these later stories, like the Gnostic stories, are 2nd century to 4th, sometimes going on to the 5th. I mean, they're simply far too away from our frame of reference here to take much of them seriously. They show legendary embellishments for the most part.
Yeah, but a lot of the apostles that come, we get that in the 2nd century. A lot of it.
Well, like the Simon Magus story, for example, what year would you attribute that to, Miguel? When we're talking about Simon Magus being at the same time as Jesus?
Well, I mean, if Acts is correct, he is a contemporary of Jesus. Now, I don't know if Acts is correct. I think Acts is a lot of fiction, and it's a novel. Yes, it gets a lot of things straight, right? I mean, historical, but that's like saying, Harry Potter lived in London at this time. Yeah, you get the history right, yes. But some of the events are probably they're definitely pretty questionable. So it's up. I'll let you guys decide. Do you accept Simon Magus or not?
But at the least, could we say that because Acts has Simon Magus within it, that means that this idea that these heretics came much later, we can at least agree that that is not the case. But Tyler, you said that you are not aware of it. Does that mean that you're not aware of that particular passage from Acts, or where can we go from here?
I'm aware of that. My point is the story in Simon Magus in Acts is very minimal, very remarkably minimal. Yes, Simon Magus is listed as the father of heresies by several church fathers later on. That's not the same thing. What I'm saying is legendary stories about Simon Magus from the 2nd to 4th century, which are far too late to actually matter, don't tell us much about who Simon Magus actually was. Now, when I say diversity came later, and you had the proto-Orthodox came first, yes, you do have throughout the New Testament, you have Judaizers, you have the Gnostics, for example, you have even all these kind of things. But they were parasitic on a proto-Orthodox church, right? There were various disputes, but it's not enough to say that there's this original diversity that has an equal claim to the validity of what the Christian message actually is. And so the reason I say we don't have strong enough evidence of early diverse Christian communities is largely because of geographical surveys, which scholars have, sorry, my cat's come out yelling at me, meowing at me. But in any of these four main areas, for example, like in Edessa, for example, where you have Marcionism, this is part of the Bauer thesis argument, is that orthodoxy is after heresy in the case of Edessa, is that the problem is that Marcionism is that if we say that the earliest form of Christianity in Edessa was Marcionism, we have to account for basically a century of which Edessa had no Christian witness. And so this is because Marcionism did not arise until Marcion was excommunicated in Rome, until AD 144. So that means that Marcionism would not have arrived in Edessa until 150. Right. So we'd have to then say, okay, well, is there no Christian influence in Edessa from AD 50 until about 150? We could maybe say Edessa was impervious to Christianity during that period, but they didn't become a part of the Roman Empire until 216. So prior to that date, travel for early Christian missionaries in Edessa could have likely been prohibited. Right. But either way, because there was a prominent Jewish community in Edessa, it's unlikely that there had been no contact with Antioch, which is a large Jewish center in the area. So in that case, we do know that like Jews would have communicated more readily with their closer compatriots there in Antioch. And during the early years of Christianity, Jews and Christians were in close contact, right? So it's very unlikely they were unaware of Christianity. But Marcionism doesn't appear till much later in Edessa. And in fact, within the evidence of Marcionism itself, is that it acts as a kind of a corrective, right? It's not aimed at converting pagans. It's aimed as a reformation of the established church in the first place towards a kind of radical reading of Paul. So he's essentially editing out Old Testament scriptures. And this is generally a corrective movement, not a converting movement, right? When it comes to say Rome, we could say, did heresy precede orthodoxy there? Right, because Rome is supposed to be the site of what we would call Orthodox belief, and whether or not we could say it imposed their beliefs over the whole church. Right, so this assumes that we could find heretical groups in the other main churches. I can go through the other ones if we want, but Ignatius, who wasn't from Rome, he talked about theological schisms between opposing groups. He said since Ignatius is considered to be part of the Orthodox, that means there's a competition between heresy and orthodoxy. Right, so that would suggest a presence of orthodoxy that's outside of Roman control, and an orthodoxy that didn't originate with Rome and wasn't imposed by her. Right, so Asia Minor, on the other hand, there's a location pretty far away from Rome, and it's the likely provenance of many Orthodox material: John's letters, John's Gospel, Revelation, several of Paul's letters. So if you want to argue that Rome imposed orthodoxy on these regions, you'd have to give insufficient consideration to Orthodox activity in places like Asia Minor, right? The earliest liturgical texts that we possess, they come from Syria. They don't come from Rome. We also have Pliny the Younger writing to Trajan in Rome about the Christian community that exhibited Orthodox beliefs there. Right? And so finally, in Marcion of Sinope, he was, again, branded a heretic by the early Christians. He assumed that the authority of some works that were later recognized as orthodox, right? That's the Marcion canon later on in the 2nd century, which is an edited version of Luke and 10 of Paul's epistles. And I could go into the patristic literature and all the continuity between the Orthodox belief from the 1st century well into the 2nd, but that would take us.
Marcionism, I think, would be a good place to start. So, Miguel, let me know what you think.
Well, again, I wouldn't, I don't disagree. I wouldn't say Marcionism is anything like classical Gnosticism. He had some differences. I mean, there was the debate how much Marcion agreed with the Gnostics, that it was time. Well, no, actually, he even disagreed with the Gnostics, because the Gnostics did not think you should get rid of the Hebrew Bible. They just thought it should be radically deconstructed, because the Gnostics thought the Second Temporal culture had brought in this demon called Yahweh and had marginalized some of the more ancient spiritualities. As a scholar, God, I'm forgetting his name, and he's a friend of mine. He said, when you look at some of, let's say, the Mendean words and their literature, who are the remaining Gnostic, the last remaining Gnostics today, you find a pre-exilic it matches pre-exilic Hebrew, the name of the gods and the spirits. So it's likely maybe even that the Gnostics were Jews who were trying to keep before the reformations of Hezekiah and his son, and the rise of the Yahweh cult, were keeping more of the Asherah cult, more of the El cult, and they were sort of bringing it underground and sort of they kept it underground. So the Gnostics, the classical Gnostics like the Sethians, were not against the Hebrew Bible. They just thought it was the wrong information, as Paul seems to kind of hint to too. Marcion wanted to simply get away from the Old Testament. He wanted Christianity to start at zero and to move forward. And like Tyler said, he came with this shorter version of Luke. Some say, well, no, then stuff was added. You always go with the shorter version, but that's a scholarly argument. Pick your choose. And of course, Christianity had disagreed with it, because one thing you needed in ancient times, you needed a pedigree. You need to have an ancient roots, or else you wouldn't be taken seriously. And yes, many Christians did take with Hermes Trismegistus. They thought he was an old figure. He would do well. Many of the church fathers, Augustine did not like Hermes, but that was the debate. But many of the Christians moving said, no, we got to hitch ourselves to Judaism, or else we won't be taken seriously by the Roman Empire.
That's an interesting take. Before we go into the more of the philosophical part of it, what do you think about that hitching on, Tyler?
I'm not quite sure what I think about that. I mean, the search to try to find a pre-Christian Gnosticism has been largely unsuccessful. So that's about all I would say about that. I mean, the Gnostic texts are 2nd century to 4th. I could say like how we actually, for example, date them. I could go into that, but at the point it's
I would disagree. I could say some were possibly pre-Christian.
But isn't Hermes
not 100?
Trismegistus?
I'm not 100%, but when you look at Apocalypse of Adam, Secret John without Jesus, who kind of gets put into it. But I mean, we're talking about a whole debate here.
Well, if you were to,
But isn't Hermes
something...
just a literary device? He wasn't like an actual real prophet, or
they didn't know that back then. They thought he was the
I see.
church fathers and all that. With or without the Holy Spirit, they thought Hermes was historical. So it was only till like the 17th century when scholars said, "Wait a second, this guy's more of a mythical figure."
Well, he was revived by European mystery schools.
Well,
and so
Tyler was
Muslims. Everybody was really into Hermes.
Well, Tyler was presenting an example that you say would be further away from Gnosticism as far as this more established tradition. What possibly, just like I asked Tyler before, what would you, Miguel, give to Tyler as far as the most rock-solid thing to date any piece of Gnostic texts as early as possible?
Well,
and how do we know that?
But before Miguel answer that, maybe just to begin with, before Lev's question, what particular tradition of Gnosticism are you maybe a part of or defending, or do you find validity in? Like, what is the basis from which your Gnostic beliefs come from? Because there are various traditions of Gnosticism. So.
That's a good point. There were so many, and they differed even on the nature of Jesus, whether Jesus was flesh, and like the Valentinians. Valentinus was actually almost became Bishop of Rome in the 2nd century. Very admired figure. The heretic thing got put after he died by Irenaeus and others, but at the time he was a respected individual. Even the church father Eusebius says that Valentinus was the one who came up with the doctrine of the Trinity. Whether Eusebius is wrong or not, I don't know. There's not much in Valentinian works, but there were many. There were the Nessenes, the Simonians. I personally like the Sethians. They're the ones who speak to me because they seem to be the most radical, anarchist, purists out there. They're the ones who are like Neo from the Matrix, from the first Matrix, not the other shitty movies. But that's
Where they
me.
tried to
Again,
import
that's
some
me.
Eastern religion into it, yeah. So, well, this is way less hostile than the last. So yeah, go ahead, Miguel.
I want to say something on this.
You guys have hostile debates?
I had one point actually about James Valiant from last week, just really quickly.
Oh, James is so nice.
Yeah.
Nice
well, he's coming back. We're gonna have him back with Gravantus, and that should be a very.
That's gonna be amazing. But I have one point about the sort of Jesus was a Roman psyop. Now, again, I relate everything to professional wrestling. I have to. Now, Lev, when you break
Yes.
up a tag team, right? Say there's a rival faction, and you're going in a match with the rival faction, and the one tag partner double crosses his tag partner, goes to the other faction. Now, when you book it, unless you're Vince Russo, you book at the beginning of the match where he kicks the ass of his own tag partner, he joins the rival faction. Why do you do that in the beginning of the match?
I don't know. Why do you do that?
Because does it make logical sense if you're kicking the ass of the other guys that you want to join, and then at the end you betray your tag partner? Does that make
No.
logical sense? Exactly. So why would the Romans choose Paul, who was persecuting when he was Saul, persecuting, the Christians? Why would he choose the guy who's persecuting them to be like, oh shucks, oh man, I'm a Christian now? Like, that makes no sense.
I mean, I
right?
could think of one possible solution. I would love to hear Miguel.
Unless the Roman Empire was being booked by Vince Russo.
Well, no, I could. I would love to hear Miguel's thought, but my personal thought, just upon hearing this, would be even, it's like the whole even a caveman could do it type of thing. Even this person who was so against us, this is how much the power of Jesus Christ got into him that he, turned his way. So I don't know. That
True,
could be.
But then would they not reject Paul as an insincere? Wow, that's.
Well, I don't know, Miguel. What do you think?
What was the question? I'm trying.
That was more a question for James. But what I wanted to ask, I wanted to get back into the actual beliefs of Gnosticism. But Lev, ask Miguel your question again.
Yes. Okay. Here we go again. Okay. So
Right.
my question with Gnosticism was, what is the most, you would say, legitimate, earliest Gnostic text that you could present to Tyler to counter his idea that all of these ended up coming later after the Orthodox Church was already founded? What would be the thing that you could give to him?
What would be I would probably be the work of Stephen Davis and even John Turner. The Secret Book of John is a Sethian work, but it's very interesting because it's the Apostle John and Jesus having a conversation, and then it goes to like flashback to the Gnostic cosmology with the fall of Sophia and the Demiurge and and all the, this grand cosmic battle. And then it stops with Jesus talking to John. And by the way, this is what happens and that what happens. That's a good, because it almost seems like there was once a secret Sethian text, and then Jesus was sort of added, which would bring probably the Gospel of Secret Book of John in the 1st century. Some have said, like Mark Goodcare, that Gospel of Thomas is 2nd century. Again, I'm not married to any of these theories. It's possible it's 2nd century, but I'm fine with 1st century too. It's not going to change my world, and it's hard to explain. I don't think it makes something more real or authentic. I think it's the ideas that matter. I don't care if I like a lot of Paul's ideas. I don't care if it's 2nd century or 1st century.
Well, let me get to the ideas, actually. I wanted to ask Miguel, and then maybe Tyler can have a rebuttal. The claim that a lot of people make, I think, maybe nowadays, is that, Gnosticism being sort of a capstone or a sort of secret wisdom tradition or gnosis within Christianity. Now, I know you mentioned, I'm actually basing a lot of these arguments from St. Irenaeus. How there's a lot of sort of contention with the very foundational worldview of Gnosticism. Now I can go in, I'm going to get more into politics and philosophy than Tyler, who is into theology. My master's was in politics and philosophy. And so I'm very acquainted with the work of Eric Vogelin, where he talks about the secular politicized Gnosticism. But that's another time, another debate. Let's go to the Docetism, for instance. Let me ask you about that. Does not believing that the sort of the sort of cosmic Christ, or the notion that he was purely of spirit, does that not contradict a whole swath of that foundational premise of Christianity, that he had to become a man? And if Gnosticism nowadays were to claim that they are at the top, the sort of capstone of Christianity, then why would you have that? And also, why would you have a bifurcation within creation itself between the sort of lesser God and higher God? That seems to contradict foundation. Again, that's why, of course, they were labeled as heretics, because it's like the most foundationally heretical.
Well, the
spirit
Gnostics,
notion.
remember, to the Gnostics, the death and resurrection of Jesus is like it's a fictional, but it's not that important. To the Valentinians, the Gospel of
Yeah,
Judas,
yeah.
it's the way he has Judas he can go back to, but it's not as earth foundational as it is with mainstream Christianity. As far as the bifurcation, I mean, that's just, you look at the Old Testament and you see that God is insane. He's a murderer. He's a killer. He's demented. I mean, this was a vicious being, and there's no way you can
we
doll
agree
it
on
up.
that?
You can't doll it up.
Tyler,
The
can we
rabbis
agree on
and
that?
you can use allegory. You can use mythology, but God, the Hebrew God is he's not.
No, I
it's
don't.
not. It's no.
All right,
he's a
well,
psycho.
let's get into it. I think this is going to be spicy. Tyler, why do you disagree
go
with
ahead.
with
What
the
would you say?
murder
First of all,
God?
there's like 100 things I haven't gotten to reply to yet. Am I going to say anything about like the narratives of the Gospels, or how we know the Gospel of Thomas is 2nd century, which we do, right? Or this notion of Eusebius saying that Valentinus invented the doctrine of the Trinity. It's actually Eusebius reporting that his friend Marcellus says that, and the Gnostic version of the Trinity that's being referred to here is actually 3 fundamental substances, which are spirit, soul, and matter. And Tertullian accused Gnostics and Valentinus actually of saying that the 3 natures are not subject to change, which basically means that there's no notion of salvation because the soul's nature can't change. That's where that view of the Trinity comes from. He did not say that he invented the Christian version of it. As for dating the Gospel of Thomas, this is, I'm not sure if you want me to get into this, but the only
I mean, I don't have a dog in this fight. The second for, I mean, it's not going to.
Right, that's fair. But
I find all these ideas interesting.
No, that's fair. I respect that. But my point is, though, is we're trying to determine what the original proto-Orthodox Christians believed, and whether or not Gnosticism is something that could claim the legacy of Christianity, or at least being authentic, right? It may not matter so much to you, but it does matter to the audience if, say, the Gnostic Gospels are 2nd century and later, right? Because we have to see which one, the canonical Gospels, which are dominated by narratives, right? They are a form of bios, essentially, and questions of the historicity of Christ and things like this.
That's a good point, Tyler. The Gnostics did not deal with history. When you read their Gospels, they never say and so was governor, and so it was. They were writing philosophical, theological. It was, the narrative is almost not there, so that was already baked into their theology, which maybe is frustrating.
Yeah, it's common, like with the Gospel of Thomas, for example. Like
just
saying 65, they switch. With saying 66, that they switch around a lot of sayings with Jesus in order to make philosophical points, like rhetoric against materialism, for example. But the reason I say we could date to the Gnostic Gospel of Thomas to the 2nd century, and we could do this fairly well, is we have to look to reference material in the Gospel of Thomas that indicates familiarity with like a prior canonical tradition, right? So, for example, if you look at, say, what we would call special M, which is a way of saying material in Matthew, which is unique to Matthew and not found in any other synoptics, we have what would be saying 69, 32, 64, 14, 62, so on and so forth. Basically, we have around like 13 of them, for example, which are from the special M tradition. When it comes to Luke, the special L tradition, there's 5 of them. Right. When it comes to John, there's 5 more in the case of him, right? So we have the presence of special M, L, and John elements that show that there's dependence on the canonical Gospels, as well as various redactional elements, like the use of Matthean redactional elements. And there's other things too, like, so for example, we could say that it's influenced by special M, special L, written John and Matthean redactional elements and Lucan redactional elements, and then triple digitation, which is the saying that's in every 3 Gospels, right? Parable of the sower, parable of mustard seed, parable of the murderous tenants of the vineyard. And there's other things that indicate that it's the 2nd century too. Like there's the development, for example, Tatian's diatessaron in the late 2nd century. Gospel of Thomas takes quite a bit of influence from that, which was an attempt to harmonize the Gospel, so to speak. And lastly, what that all shows, and there's quite a bit more I can say about it, is that that the spread of the fourfold gospel was considered the only authoritative source for teaching, because the fact is a lot of the Gnostic gospels are made of citations and rearranging them around from that material, which would have to indicate a pre-established tradition, and it indicates their authoritative value. Right.
Now, why would so Tyler, they're precedent from the original four gospels, but why were they later chopped in various ecumenical councils? A lot of people.
Hey guys, just FYI, I got 10 minutes and I gotta go.
Oh, okay.
All right, here's the thing. I'm going to take charge right now. Tyler, I really appreciate a lot of the things you were talking about, but this last 10 minutes, I want to focus philosophy. I want to specifically focus on the angry God that I talked about before. So, Tyler, why do you think that this God, Old Testament God as a murderer, is not something that you would agree with? Not as this vengeful, evil murderer?
Well, I mean, to me, it's a bit of an odd question. It's like trying to look at our current moralistic categories and reading it back into the history of ancient Judaism. I mean, what is generally considered to be the case is that God establishes the covenant with the people of Israel, right? And then what they do is they're expected to carry out God's justice on earth on his behalf, provided that they don't violate the covenant, which they do several times. In fact, many of the things that happen to the Jews are God punishing them for effectively not carrying out this mission of justice, which he calls them to do. But the point is, again, if we're talking about, these are things I don't think we actually need to defend, right? This is talking about the punishment of God for essentially living in sin. I don't see why this is something I have to defend.
I think that's the most important thing, though. I mean, what is more important than defending?
Look at Onan. He pulls out of a woman and God hits him with a thunderbolt. It's a litany of violent, unfair punishments that don't. I mean, it's over. Diseases, famine. I mean, he hardens the Pharaoh's heart so that then he can punish the Egyptians and kill their firstborn innocent. Just look at the flood. What did kittens do? Poor kittens got drowned, and babies. What did the kittens do? So, and I'm not, look, I was raised to think these were just mythologies. These were fables. This was just the ancient people expressing their, I have other ideas now, but there is a way out. But if you want to defend his character, you're defending a demon.
I do think what Tyler's getting at is that it's often argued. It's funny you're mentioning that, because I would expect that of, I guess, like the new atheists, right? But I think when you're sort of placing moral categories, or rather corporeal moral categories, that we view ourselves as 21st century beings to the God of the Old Testament, it's kind of, there's something that makes me kind of question that, in the sense of, well,
the Gnostics are criticizing the same things in their text. They're saying, what is this guy doing? Like in the texts are like, when God says, Adam, is that you? And the Gnostics are like, what are you, stupid? He's right there. You can't recognize Adam. I mean, so they were asking these questions back then because they were trying to, again, figure out where to hitch their wagons. What kind of God? Plato's one, or this tribal Yahweh God?
And this is what confuses me. Why would the wagon be hitched on specifically in terms of the Old Testament? And this is somebody, I'm Jewish by, my mom's side. So I feel very free about criticizing any of these Old Testament elements. But why specifically hitch your wagon on that God? Why not criticize that God? Why not say that this was wrong and the way that Jesus points to is right?
To be fair, there are many saints that have done that, but go ahead.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Well, again, I'm not even sure what the argument here is. I mean, we're talking about survival in the ancient world, that this is a totally different time period, different context. Like a lot of the things, for example, Levitical laws aren't even things that are prescribed by God. They're largely just laws that are in place, that are civic, and they're done for their survival. I think it's easy to look back on moral categories we have now and then be like, oh, well, this is terrible. Except we're using moral categories that come largely out of Christianity. I mean, the pagan world had a thing for dominance. The whole reason that they looked at Christ and said, this is shameful, is because he lost. That Right? He died on the cross. They expected someone would overthrow and they would triumphantly rule on their behalf. And the story of Christ overthrows this, right? And this is a lot of social dynamics in Rome that change, right? There's a lot of criticisms of, say, domestic violence that you find that the early church is the first people to actually speak out about, people like St. John Chrysostom and the like. But we're looking back at the Old Testament through Christian morality and saying, okay, well, this is bad. But like I said,
but this isn't about morality, though. I'm sorry to interrupt, but the big problem for me is that it's not about morality. Either you believe that this was the God that existed, the God, not a God, the God. So either you believe the God existed, or you don't, or you think it's a story because this is the way that people were living, this is the story that they told, and these are the laws that they had. So my question to you, Tyler, is which is it? Do you see this as just being a story for the time, and this God does not exist, or does this God exist absolutely as this real God who did these real things that Miguel would consider to be horrible?
Okay, well, it sounded like we were talking about moral outrage at first, but now the way you phrase it now, again, the Old Testament isn't my field at all, but one thing I'll say, it depends what book of the Old Testament we're talking about. Like, for example, the book of Jonah is a satire. The whole story over and over again, which uses a lot of mythical elements. It's a lot of things you're supposed to laugh at. It's the fact that Jonah is this prophet called by God, and he's supposed to be like, I have to show that I care about the Gentiles, right? Them here to deliver God's justice, and he keeps failing over and over again and gets swallowed by a giant fish. It's supposed to be mocking the idea that you would only care about your own people rather than the God who is effectively God over all of creation. Genesis, for example, this is another example I'm more friendly with. But while I do believe in like a real Adam and Eve, for example, the story of Genesis is written as a Hebrew chiasm, which is a form of Hebrew poetry, and it's done within the cosmology of an ancient Hebraic worldview, right?
Same with Song of Songs, right? It's basically Hebrew poetry, yeah.
So basically what I'm saying is it depends. We can't ask these things in a blanket way. In the Old Testament, you have poetry, you have like Song of Songs, you have Levitical law, you have, which is effectively civil codes, you have genealogies, you have a myth, which again is meant to portray a truth that, you know, God creates the world from nothing, right? This is creation ex nihilo. That's something distinct from God's, which create from pre-existing matter, right? So again, that Old Testament scholarship isn't really my area, but we could say the same thing about the New Testament too. There's letters.
But then why can't something like Jesus being the Son of God, or whatever predictions are made as far as how this world will end, why can't that also be like Jonah and the whale? Why can't that also be an analogy to something else? Why can we pick one thing and not another thing to take it to?
Roman Catholicism doesn't take the Protestant view of Revelation, the Apocalypse of John. It's a time that happened there. It's not the end of the world or anything else.
But I actually agree with Miguel on that.
There we go. But then what are the elements that are taken seriously?
The prediction of it is right in the Gospel of John, that you can't really predict when it happens. So I'm sorry, Protestant. Sorry, Hall Lindsey. Ain't gonna like Great Planet Earth.
But then I know Miguel.
Let me answer your question. Okay. Is that?
And then we'll go back to Miguel because I know he has to go.
Well, in the New Testament, it's because the intention of it is the foundation of the Christian faith, and I know that's like the argument. I mean, Tyler, you probably have more nuance, but I wanted to actually, I'll give that one to Tyler. But before Miguel goes, Lev's question, but also I wanted to ask you of it's funny how a lot of people accuse Christianity in particular of being sort of like life denying, you know, the old Nietzscheanism, but Gnosticism sort of goes a step further. And this world is satanic, this world is darkness, so forth. And so how do you view the sort of Gnostic teaching upon the world? Do you see it as fundamentally life-denying, or do you see that as sort of just a step towards a greater liberation?
Are you asking me or the Gnostic?
I think it's asking you, Tyler.
Yeah,
you're asking me? I thought you were asking
well, you're
Tyler.
the Gnostic here, so
yes.
I'm a heretic. Yeah.
Because maybe Tyler can stay a bit later. You have to go.
Yeah, I mean, I think what did Aristotle always said? The measure of genius is to see the world as it is, and that's holding opposite views. I think the Gnostics really saw the world as it truly was, which is both a horror and a beauty. There is both divinity and light, hence the dualism. You can say it wasn't like Zoroastrian dualism; it was more mitigated dualism. But they saw that the problem with most religions is that they got their heads up their ass. So as I say, I don't think humans are descended from apes, but ostriches, because humans are great at keeping their heads in the sand. Oh, it's a lovely world. And the Gnostics were the ones to say, and I think they were borrowing from, or I think they were right, that this world is a both equal parts horror and holiness. And they saw it as a very flawed world, and they really thought 2,000 years before it was a scientific, acceptable scientific, they saw it was a simulation. It wasn't just a nice false illusion. It was coded to keep us trapped, to keep those of us, our consciousness asleep. And it was a matter of could we wake up? And they weren't just coming up with things, out of nothing. Look at Plato's cave, the great Gnostic allegory. Look at the myth of Prometheus. Look at so many other teaching, even in the Timaeus, where Plato talks about the demiurge. Plato does say, yes, he sees the demiurge as good, but the problem with the demiurge is that he rises up and he leaves the young gods in charge of creation, and they botch it up. The Book of Enoch. There was a lot going around that really, the Gnostics really came with the idea of a simulated reality, but there was a lot of literature saying that this world is really in charge of demonic powers. And they looked at Paul, Book of Enoch, the Hebrew Bible. They looked at the Greek philosophers, and they looked at a lot of the Egyptian mythology. So, and I would agree with them. I would agree. We tend to think this is such a wonderful world. And as they say in AA, it's only until you realize you have a problem you can do about it. We all want to hide under the skirts of a benign God instead of just seeing that this world is full of suffering and it needs us. It needs us to step up as beings of light.
Right. And I think the radical claim of Christianity, as apart from a lot of other all pagan traditions, is that the radical claim that this world is of creation, that this world is of God. And I think that's, I don't know,
it's
Tyler,
a good creation,
Yeah. Well,
even Paul says the Creator God is. Even Paul says the Creator God is good. The Gnostics would disagree with him.
Mm-hmm. So if Miguel has to go, Tyler, you could say a little bit.
And Miguel, thank you so much. Thank you so much for coming in. And you have probably one of the best voices in all of BTR history.
If only my kids and wife thought so. If only they thought my voice was so good. Well, thanks, guys. Lev, Gio, Tyler, nice to meet you.
Thank you.
Enjoy the debate.
Thank you.
Take care.
You guys have a good night.
Come back.
Good night.
Please.
I will.
So as we're transitioning now,
that was less confrontational than I thought it was going to be.
So don't worry, we're gonna have a lot more we're gonna have a lot more confrontational streams coming up. I love, by the way, how we were able to see Tyler's transition in the background of seeing that beautiful view and now seeing the kitchen from the light. That's very nice.
Yeah.
The cat was great. The dog was great. All of it was great. What I'm gonna do right now, fellas, is I am going to call Gnostic Informant. I have no idea where the heaven he is. I'm going to call him up, see if he can still come in here. While that's happening, Gio, read the people who are in there, and also beg for super chats. I'll tell you why.
Really
here's
quickly,
why.
then please remember the question you wanted to answer Tyler after.
Yes,
so.
And here's why about the super chats. If you guys don't know, you see the bar over here. There's a super chat bar along with the chat, the BTR chat king of the chat. That is Comfy Lad, $9.99. Number one, I want to test this thing out. I want to see if it actually works, which means I need to get a super chat more than $5. If you give it more than $5, then it should change the alignment of the people in the scroll bar. If not, I'm gonna have to go back to the drawing board and figure out what's going on. But this is a technical test, so thank you very much. I just wanted to get that out of the way. And
I like how Miguel brought out the boomer jokes.
Yes.
Take my wife, please. I bring my wife everywhere, but then she comes back home.
All right, I'll be right back.
All right, so we have Philip Daniel, as always, my good friend. That's it, 36. Baltic, Fresh, Michael, CS, Atuflame, is that how you pronounce it? Baltic, Agner Warts, Little Prince, Mr. Duxology, Vilemouth, Fresh, Asterix Foundation, Moral Outrage Prophet, as always, ABC 12345, Putana, RG, who's one of my trolls. Who else do we got? Evangelum. We have Luke Saville. We have Kai Chigaskop. Is that how you pronounce it? I said Mr. Fresh. I said Michael. James Stovall. We have AT. We have Alex Alpine. We also have Alex Alpine. Nico, as always. Considering Flabia. Phlebus. Considering Phlebus. Nico. Who else am I missing here? We also had Donald Kemp beginning. We had the Prudentialist give us a super chat. Good friend, the Prudentialist. Good friend Keith Woods, as always. Nollis, another good friend of ours. Thank you for coming, Nollis. Who else do we have? Oscar Toe, as always. Oscar Toe. Who is that? Did I say Mr. Dixology? Yes. Jib D. Valentina 777. Maybe one day we'll get Thomas 77 on the show. Seraphim Goose, our good moderator, our Janny Seraphim Goose. Holy Marmot. Got Holy Marmot. And I think that's Ralph Dude 7. Who else do we got? And I think AT, I said AT. Define Divine. Byron. And we have a $7 super chat from ABC. I just want to highlight what Philip said. Gnosticism is pre-industrial transhumanism. Holy crap. That's a pretty good one, actually. Tyler, what do you think of this connection people are making between Gnosticism and transhumanism? Our good friend Keith Woods had a definitive video on the subject.
Yeah, I made that argument as well in the video last year. This is something in our discussion I would have liked to have gotten to, although there's been like tons of things I haven't been able to respond to yet. But the one particularly interesting thing in the Gospel of Thomas is Jesus proclaims that, in order for a woman to be saved, she has to first make herself a man, right? All throughout the Gnostic Gospels, the whole idea is that materiality is something degraded and gross, and that you would have to have knowledge, gnosis, of some secret abstract spirit world beyond, right? This is very Neoplatonic. Right? This is essentially a kind of rule of the abstract that's very fitting for the technological age that we live in, which the kind of hyper neoliberalism that we live in now very much pushes forward the exact same sort of message, and even has direct antidotes to the tradition of Gnosticism. For example, I think it's the Gospel of Philip, or the Gospel of Peter, I can't remember which one it is, but it's about restoring Adam to his original androgynous, genderless nature.
Yeah, the andrine that Pelletin and other people will talk about later.
Yeah.
They have a similar thing in the Kabbalah as well about the restoration of Adam Kadmon, which is the primordial man. And that is, I guess the best way to describe it is God in the creation of the universe basically created a space of not being exactly as God is, if that makes sense. So imagine if God is everything, then this space would just be like this little sliver especially created for there to be an experience of life God without being God, basically. So something separate from God. And the idea is not to create some what do you call, like the transgender library people, what do you call it, the story hour, not to do the trans story hour, but the idea is to get back to oneness with God, which means that the gender is basically an analogy for the separateness, for the splitting of something that was once whole. But I just want to throw that in there just to show for all the people thinking like, oh, means like, they're practicing Gnosticism today. I highly doubt it.
That was Eric Vogelin's contention, is that basically every eschatological political movement is in itself a form of Gnosticism because it reveals a higher truth of existence. And I would say that, for example, there's this passage from the Pisces Sophia, it is foolish to give birth to mortal children in this world. A lot of early Gnosticism, they are sort of almost inkling, and ironically enough, at a form of like antinatalism, in the sense of like, some of them have, like what Tyler was saying, has like a lot of like bonkers anti-woman texts, which is ironic considering Christianity being like the Chad Trad anti-woman religion, right? Stereotypically, a lot of them, they have this view of the creation of new souls being fundamentally flawed because you were putting beings in this world of suffering. And it's like a lot of I would say like degenerative liberal ideas that people have now. A lot of like Eric Voegelin essentially ties it back to more ancient forms of Gnosticism, and like the fact that like a lot of like modern you would say like the Thomas Ligotti nihilist schools of people, well, they sort of like tie things back to Gnosticism too, which is kind of interesting. Keith Wood's Vogelin's argument's crap. Well, a lot of people do disagree with Vogelin. I mean, it can become a very simple heuristic. I mean, Tyler, what do you think of this view of Gnostic nihilism?
I'm mixed on that question. This is a much larger question. I don't take much influence from Vogelin myself, but we went over this on Theopolitics, specifically in Hegelianism. You have a kind of influence of Gnosticism, at least from the shoemaker Jacob Bohm, right, mixed into his Trinitarianism, which overly focuses on the notion of economic trinity over that of immanent trinity that you find in Christianity, right? So there is, in various movements of intellectual history, there's direct influence from Gnosticism. The comparison of Gnosticism that people make is that you have an idea of a disembodied soul. This is a view of the soul which is not bound up with the body. Rather, materiality is something that is a degradation, it's a fall, you're something stuck into it. You have to get outside that nature to something which is apparently outside the universe, beyond some free-forming world of the soul. Why people tie this back in, the Gnosticism say, to what's going on in politics right now. It's somewhat of a complicated story, but in one sense, again, as we did with like the Gnostic Gospels, the restoration of the original androgynous character of sorts is a kind of disembodied self, which is genderless, which is beyond, which is conforming with the spirit world. Because what we do know, biology, bodily, the kind of bodily approach to consciousness that we have, is how we understand ourselves and our consciousness. This ties back into my work in embodied cognition. Right. Is entirely bound up with our physical presence in the world. It's the way in which our bodies are formed, they develop, the way in which there's kind of a narrative that goes on, so to speak, where the results of the actions that we take in the community also has an effect, which is sometimes goes back on us and forms us who we are. It's this kind of loop of the material world together that forms this kind of contingent relation of what makes humanity humanity. But the problem with Gnosticism is you're trying to imagine a human which is essentially a disembodied soul without material. And again, material is a degradation. But the view that I have, which is the view of the early Christian theology, which is the view of embodied cognition and phenomenology, is that what makes us who we are in the first place, what we call a soul, is the dynamic interactivity between the world and the object. Right. There is no conceivable relation outside of that, which is something I wanted to get into, because why people talk and accuse Gnosticism of being a lot like transgenderism and all that kind of phenomenon today is we're denying essentially the bodily basis of our existence to try to have, say, a transhumanist uploading of, say, consciousness onto a computer, which, again, because of the notions of tense time and internal time consciousness, which itself ties back to instinctual engagements of the body with the world, simply precludes any notion of that actually being coherent. So this is where the tying together is, right? Partly just that, but there's also, again, if you go back to Cartesianism, notions of substance dualism and the way that these kinds of subject-object distinctions in consciousness persist throughout time, up from Descartes to Kant to Hegel, and all the way even to, oddly enough, the Kantian cognitive sciences, who are fully physicalists, but they nonetheless affirm the idea that all things that we receive are through our sense organs into the brain, which then creates a dualism where you can't quite know the true world outside. Now, that being said, this is what I wanted to reply to our friend Miguel there, because this idea that, the world is full of suffering, this is why it's we can't affirm the world's goodness. The difference and so you need to fly into this kind of Gnostic notion of paradise. But the difference with the Christian story is that, again, we start that the world is created good, but we have this fall, we have suffering. Right? We have the limits of justice. Every time we try to get justice, we don't quite get justice. We have our relationships, right? No matter how beautiful they are, the partner inevitably dies. Sometimes we break our trust. We're in need of redemption. Families have generational abuse passed on, the various motions of power throughout the world, just like Imperial Rome and the American Empire today, and other instances of power around the world. It's a kind of cycle where we think of, we bomb the world and we'll make the world better, and it kind of makes this feedback loop of revenge and the like. So what I said about the Christian story, and someone in the chat said, this sounds very satanic to say Christianity is more material than materialism. What I
Oh, I
mean
want to
by
ask you. Yeah, I want to clarify, but we didn't have time. So you go ahead.
Yeah, what I mean by that is with the Christian story, and again, the importance of the sacraments, like taking of the Eucharist, for example, is you're taking the body and blood of Christ into you. And that's not just a personal thing that happens to an individual. It's about the formation of a community, which is to act as the kingdom of God in the world, right? So it transforms matter, it sacramentalizes it.
Right.
The whole origin is to transform matter back into a creation mode where we're in participation with the intention of God, right? We're participating in God's being. So
Right.
the view in Christianity versus Gnosticism is the fact that Christianity takes a look and says, okay, Jesus takes all the suffering into the world, into himself on the cross. He cries out, my God, why have you forsaken me? This is why I said the importance of Christianity is that it's a God who comes into history, which is different from the nonsense that you have to go beyond because you're denying the world. The truth of the Christian message is that we are sacramentalizing the world, right? We are changing how we fundamentally organize our communities, the kind of form of life that we have. And this is why it's very, very pertinent to political issues as well, because what we have in the neoliberal world is we have a distinction of, say, the economic versus the realm of human sympathy, at least if you're David Hume. What you have is like this kind of abstracting of the economic as having its own law. What you're having is political hierarchy related to merit and no notions of virtue. But what we do have in Christianity is, say, an example of the economic, which is an economy of the gift, right? And then you model the value based on God's original gift to humanity, which is non-reciprocal, right? In the case of political hierarchy, it would be a virtue of hierarchy according to who actually is following the way we're supposed to live when the law becomes written on your heart. That's another important thing about the law in Paul, by the way, is it becomes a part of your everyday being, right? In itself, it is a new community that is set out on a mission. So what Christianity gives you is a knowledge of creation, the good of creation, but the suffering of the world, and it doesn't deny it. And then what it gives you is a demand that you have to go out and love your neighbor, that you have to reconfigure the world with a lot of faith and courage to put yourself out, just like the early church and the persecution. And it's not an easy answer. You are saying no to the world that makes truth by power. You are saying this is the truth. And we're going to organize communities based on that.
And this is fundamentally different than early Judaic messianism. It's different than sort of the concept of like, Klee's angel of history going back in time. Of course, that comes from Benjamin, who's a Marxist. It's different in the sense of like, it is not that all of history becomes resurrected, but it's from that fissure in history that Christ represents that then humanity as a whole is sort of saved, rather than sort of the sort of the coming to terms with what does Benjamin say? The sort of like coming to terms with the rectification of all history, especially for the Jewish people that were persecuted, blah, blah, blah. It's like, how is it different from that early messianism? Or is it a logical step in sort of another direction from that? Like, or is it sort of like in harmony with that idea?
It's continuous and it's discontinuous. Like
right.
I said sometime earlier in this that the example, the worldview of Second Temple Judaism is that the Messiah would overthrow Rome, rule on their behalf. Right? This is what motivated the Sicarii, for example. And so the idea, like, again, Pharisees, which were considered lower class by the Sadducees, they believed that a physical resurrection would accompany the fulfillment of the promise to Israel, which is ruling on their behalf and overthrow Rome and get the Romans out of Jerusalem. Sadducees denied a physical resurrection, but they still nonetheless had a kind of revolutionary messianism to it. But the point, and same with the Qumran community, they fully believed in physical resurrection. But all these things, again, goes to a narrative which is 100% historical, which is that there's a promise to the covenant of Israel that will be fulfilled by the returning of the Lord, that their covenant, that God has not abandoned his people. And so the expectation in Second Temple Judaic literature, and as well the many revolts of the various Jewish movements, and as well as the other messiahs which failed, and in fact they failed, and when they died, people abandoned them. This is something quite different than Jesus. Right. Is they had this expectation that was very tribalistic and particularistic, because that vengeance would be on Rome. But instead, in the Christian story, there's this idea that it's for the suffering of the world in general, that Jesus defeats powers, the principalities of the earth by suffering, by putting himself out there in his place, right? This isn't like a penal substitution atonement theory of like John Calvin. This is a reordering of the cosmos. This is Christus Victor. And so what this leads to, including the example of Jesus himself, even throughout the Gospels, is a breaking of social lines. It's an idea of a new community formed around the announcement that the covenant of Israel has been fulfilled. And so then Christianity becomes a missionary religion to live in the reality that the kingdom of God is both here, that the material world is where you find the kingdom of God, and we have to sanctify it on behalf of others around us. That is a burden. That's an ethical demand. And so it's a kingdom that is here, but also a kingdom to come.
Right. Tyler, I have a couple of questions.
So, and I have another one too that's more contemporary, but someone claims that Christianity is only about loving thy neighbor. What the hell? That's
I think my question is going to be pretty contemporary and historical at the same time. Probably more historical than contemporary. So, was there anything in the New Testament where there was a prediction that after Jesus comes, there's going to be this New Jerusalem, but before that New Jerusalem comes in, the powers and principalities, especially within the Christian church, especially within the Christian communities, are going to be participating in some of the bloodiest battles of all time, in terms of the amount of people that died based on the differences of religion, especially within Christianity itself. That this is an example where you have people who were discontinued from going against powers and principalities of Rome. Meanwhile, their children's children end up upping the ante, I think, when it comes to the amount of brutality and savagery that ends up occurring. So I'm curious how you see Christianity being able to deal with those particular outcomes as opposed to any New Jerusalem.
Well, Lev, when the steppe Aryans genocided the Abos, what did they say before?
Namaste,
they said,
namaste, yes.
Go ahead, Tyler, go ahead.
Right. I mean, the Sibylline as a church is made up of people, right? And they're fallible. These things are gonna happen. It's just the way it is. But no, there's nothing in the Gospels about or the New Testament or about any kind of future wars being fought over or any kind of violence in the name of Christ. But I would push back on some of this, though, because we actually did a whole series on my channel called The Myth of Religious Violence, where we actually took on board directly the claims, say, for example, the so-called European wars of religion actually had very much to do with religion. For the most part, they didn't. I mean, there's instances in which Catholics team up with Protestants against Catholics and the like. And I'm not going to give the full argument.
It was political, mostly. It was
we did 4 videos going through the whole history in detail, names, dates, everything. So, but the general point is what that was a war of the rising absolutism, which was a way of, the various princes and the monarchs carving up sovereign states. And effectively, they were like changing their religious allegiance from one week to the next to the other, right? And so there's various things like this. There's other things like, for example, there's no doubt that the Catholic Church or Christianity in general has contributed to some obviously horrific things. I do think it's vastly overplayed, though. Like, for example, 16th century witch burning, for example, that wasn't the church. In fact,
those mostly Protestants too, eh? That was
well, actually, again, this ties back into the absolutist point. But Witch's Hammer was published by a secular court. It was actually Thomas Hobbes, of all people, who argued for the necessity of burning witches.
Based,
and even then, the Inquisition was largely like a way of saying, the church saying, like, look, things about like witches and all that, it's superstitious. So we'll set up another body that will determine whether or not these people are engaged in heresy or superstition. And in fact, Inquisition, which a lot of base tradcasts kind of get very sad when they realize was actually incredibly mild. In fact, people would often try to get tried on the Inquisition. They would commit a crime, and then they would be like, I got to give a heresy now because the Inquisition is much more milder. So,
wait, how do we know this?
Well, there's just plenty of...
A lot of historical records.
Yeah.
All right, can you give me some examples? Because I want to take a look at this.
Okay, usually, do you need the data?
Yes, I need the data. No, because usually when things are brought up...
There's one in particular definitive secular work on the Inquisition, Tyler. I forget the name of it.
when you remember that, again, that's not quite my field. I deal with philosophy and theology and cognitive science. But what I will say, though, is again, to the sake of the audience, if they're interested in the information about the religious wars, and you as well, Lev, if you want to see us go over in detail, because it's a part of the story we tell, actually, of how we get fake disciplines like political science and political economy and economics.
Oh, no! I have an MA in political science.
It's a part of...
I wasted my money. Actually, I didn't have to pay, though, because it came...
I mean, in the strong sense. Social science in the strong sense, not in the sense of various data from theory. But anyways,
I know it is all bullshit, though.
My point is, if the audience is interested in learning, checking that out, as well as the sources we use, people like William Kavanagh, for example, who we had on the show, is a scholar. I actually knew him for quite a few years, had coffee with him. But it's called On Theopolitics. Look up The Myth of Religious Violence if you want to check my sources.
So I have another question, Les Gio, because I know you had a question. Go for it, buddy.
This is more of left field, but you were mentioning your work on embodied cognition, taking from people like Husserl and Merleau-Ponty. Do you see in contemporary academia, is there sort of a fissure between, is there like a whole lacuna between that sort of work of the phenomenologists? I would include Heidegger, of course, I'm a Heidegger stan, and sort of the more like newer contemporary posthumanism, the sexy, vibrant matter people. Like, is there sort of a split between embodied cognition as such and like what these people want to take into, like, people that talk about what's that thing where you have another limb? What's it called? Prosthesis and
phantom limb.
Well, yeah, they use that, like prosthesis is a big theory. There's sort of like, xenofeminism and things of that nature. So are you seeing like in even contemporary academia, is there sort of like a split between, Heidegger, Agamben to an extent, Merleau-Ponty, the phenomenologists, and, Graham Harman, people of that nature? Brazier, there you go.
Actually, interesting about Brazier, the first time I did a conference, I was actually with, I spoke with Richard Swinburne, who's like a famous Christian philosopher. He's actually Eastern Orthodox, although he's a British guy. He doesn't look like he'd be Eastern Orthodox. He just kind of looks like he looks like a trash Oxford professor, basically. But I actually gave an argument from Ray Brassier's book, Enlightenment and Nihil Unbound, Enlightenment and Extinction. I was arguing against postmodern theology, specifically people like Jean Caputo and all them who argue that, God doesn't exist, God insists, God exists in the relation when we have an ethical relation to another person. It's kind of Levinasian, although a bit more.
Very Levinasian,
but a bit more Derridian too, in the sense that there's an unknowability behind it all. But I did use an argument about like the phenomenological impact of the death of the sun, essentially, that breaks apart various conditions of human knowledge and a priorize, like a lot of brass. That's a whole other topic. But I did use speculative realism in some senses, and in some ways it's salvageable. But ultimately, I do reject some speculative realists. But if there's a split, embodied cognition is largely a question. It's a paradigm, and it questions a lot of the dual neuroscientific reductionism. It questions a lot of the kind of
Chalmers,
and the like. So, is there been a split? There is. I mean, across the embodied cognition tradition, which originally was from Merleau-Ponty, but it's the later texts of Husserl, which were originally unread, but now all of a sudden they're being taken seriously. Which I'm a Husserlian, like Husserl on kinesthetic perception and the role of affectivity when it comes to intentionality, the life
world of an object intersecting with intentionality. Yeah.
I'm
having flashbacks to like my fourth year. Go ahead.
But anyways, the main point here, though, is that the embodied cognition tradition is essentially saying that what makes us human, what makes us conscious, is not something localized to the brain. The brain is a necessary condition for consciousness, but it's not a sufficient condition for consciousness. And there's a whole bunch of arguments against neuroreductionism that come with that. But basically what we're saying is that brain, body, environment, intersubjective community, as well as extended mind, which can be included among that, like, for example, using a pen, kinds of technology, is that what makes us who we are, what forms our consciousness, our engagement with the world, is entirely the way in which the embodied perception, which is wired for action. Right? So this is an important piece of embodied cognition, is that we don't have a theoretical engagement to the world. We don't think of things like you receive a sensation and you mentally calculate it and then you make a decision. Rather, there's a pre-theoretical engagement with the world, which is based on action, right? I look and I see a chair, I have a perception of the chair, I can sit on it, right? When I'm catching a ball, I don't calculate the speed of the ball and where it's going to land. I have a engagement with the world that comes about through familiarity and repetition. But what that means then is that the various things we localize, say brain, body, environment, community, is that these are autonomous, but they also interact. And so one change in one changes something in the other. So for example, a community change, the way in which we have a kind of self-understanding, if we want to use Heidegger's term, a kind of horizon of being, is going to fundamentally impact the brain, the body, but also the feedback loop the other way. The ideas we put into the world are going to also change that community, right? So there's that self-understanding is generated by this complex layer of meaning that we add on, and it comes to interact each other. So when it comes to the transhumanist thing, is there's two critiques here. One is partly just because of Husserlian internal time consciousness when it comes to the way in which consciousness is across a temporal stream, right?
It's not like a memory bank. It's not like an external hard drive that you can. It's very
it's not a static thing, right? You only have a static ego when you stop and reflect on your own ego, in which case you're reflecting back.
And Husserl would say in that moment of reflection, that's sort of the second order of it. That's like the noetic.
Yeah. But rather we inhabit a pre-conscious, pre-theoretical stream in which everything kind of appears in this way, right? Mm-hmm. So the point is that when you're trying to take a snapshot of consciousness, and again, I'd have to go into critiques of neuroscience, evolutionary psychology, and all that to fully draw this out. But if you try to upload that onto a computer and then said, okay, well, now we have you, that is you right there. Well, I mean, you're only just like, that's a snapshot of you, right? For it's not you, but it's not just saying you would only have yourself for that moment. Is that there is no self without time. Everything we do is engage with the action with the world. There is no self without physicality. There's no self without instinct, right? There's no language without abstraction out of a certain situation, and there's no meaning conferring without a kind of relation to the world, which is always transcendent. Now, this gets back to the theological point that I want to make too in regards to this. It's because we don't see language as expressing reality, and there's a one-to-one relation with language and meaning. Rather, language reflects reality. But but the world is transcendent in the sense that there's always an overflowing of saturation and meaning, which overwhelms our intentionality to kind of grasp it. And this is Marion's point, the phenomenologist, about the saturated phenomenon.
And then he's taking that from Derrida, right?
So there's always a kind of engagement with the world and within our meaning that is ineffable, that is beyond our understanding. It's always, every kind of culture we have is bound up in mythology. It's bound up in these kind of symbolic relations. There's no original humanity to go back to, like the dipshit Karl Marx, which James was bringing up. Marx is like a secular Christian. That's total nonsense.
So
it's German social science. It's German social science. It's Comte, right? It's Feuerbach. Right. It's an idea of a pre-critical humanity where there's no tainting from the world, right? That's, again, kind of a similarity to a Gnostic perspective.
Well, Rousseau in some ways.
Yeah.
But I wonder, though, if we can extend Heidegger's community of mortals idea. You were talking about how we're embodied within community, and care by necessity dictates that there is a relation between one and the other. Do you feel that the transhumanist ideal, or any form of Gnosticism, the way that they picture Gnosis, is that sort of a breaking up of Heidegger's notion of like the community of mortals? Do you think, can you find, that would be an interesting paper to explore in some ways?
My perspective on Heidegger is a little more critical than a lot of it. I'm more in the Husserl tradition and Husserl to Merleau-Ponty, and then from there, Heidegger obviously has an influence on this. And I have Heidegger talks about the pre-theoretical engagement with the world.
Right.
He does. Heidegger actually had a lot of critiques through Herbert Dreyfus of the emerging ways we understood artificial intelligence. He was very, very influential in that, and that I'm grateful. Yes. But my disagreement with Heidegger comes from the fact that what, according to him, is what makes you get out of bed in the morning, what makes you have this relation with the world, is essentially an absence, and that absence is the realization of death. So the dispute between the Merleau-Ponty Husserl side versus Heidegger is we don't have an absence as the final marker, so to speak, as what makes us human, right? What we have again is a bodily relation with the world, which we can actually measure, and we can be like, okay, that's it right there. So that's the distinction between us. So Heidegger, I think he just doesn't prescribe an accurate or really serious enough critique. I don't mean serious in the sense that he's not serious. Obviously, he's brilliant. I mean serious in the sense that he really gets to the heart of the danger, because there's always a kind of ineffability that's left over in Heidegger. Right. So the later Heidegger gets very mystical.
That's what I mean. The later Heidegger questions that absence as something akin to Wu Wei, where it's making room, it's clearing to reveal itself in this very very, I would say, how shall I put it? The relation that is very there's upsurges, there's there's slipping in and out. It's almost Taoistic in some ways, like it's very ephemeral.
And the main difference with us is we see a stronger danger than Heidegger does, because what we're essentially saying is that because of this interactivity, is that just because, say, it's not possible to upload your consciousness into a computer, the kind of society that we have and what it does to ourselves, to our conscious, if we accept this, even in a minor circumstance, does influence us, right? Like even like the most basic example, we lived very sedentary lives. We're not meant to live sedentary lives. We're not meant to sit around on our ass all day. But you start getting unhealthy, you start getting more depressed, right? This is a danger that comes with the fact that we're not living in accordance with how our mind and our body evolved, which is, again, in this kind of relation with the world. And you tamper with that, even if it's just the level of ideas, you're bringing about a very dangerous future. And this is something that's happened, I guess we can agree with Heidegger here, since the quantification of the world with Galileo.
Yes, exactly.
We see ourselves, and this is what makes scientific reason what it is, by the way, in modernity. It's not this bland idea that they just become empirical all of a sudden, even we have knowledge. It's tied to instrumentalism. It's tied to how we use it. And now everything becomes tied to how we use it. And so in a way, you become bound to fate, kind of like Horkheimer and Adorno talked about in the dialectic.
Yeah, that's a good place, I think, to shift this in a slightly different direction, maybe. So when we're talking right now about embodied cognition, about people having to have a community around them, having to have something to bounce off of in order to be who they are. That's correct, right? Am I understanding you?
That's one of them. Yeah, well, there's like 5 things: embodied, embedded, enacted, extended, intersubjective. You could add affectivity, but that would be one of them. Would be what you're getting at.
Yes. So with this idea, you're talking about people being unhealthy and having that sedentary lifestyle bite them in the ass, because there's a certain way that they have to be. There's a certain way that they have to be in order to be healthy and thrive. And I 100% agree, but I would take it one step further. And this is, again, just my own particular experiments. You could say, well, there's some weird thing going on in my brain. I'm hallucinating. Some weird stuff is going on. But when it comes to something that's found a lot in Eastern mysticism, specifically in Hinduism, if we're talking about something like the Kundalini Shakti, which is this energy that it resides in the spine, and it's this subtle spiritual energy. You can say that the closest thing would be the description of ether as this fine energy that what were they called? The alchemists try to obtain. Making matter into an almost spiritual-like substance. This spiritual-like substance, that's at least what I read about. What I experience, I cannot tell you at all whether it is or is not this. All I can tell you is I breathe in, and I feel a cool sensation going up my spine, and then going down my spine, like this little strand, this little string. And many descriptions that I hear of people who have had it, and various gurus, whoever, whatever you want to call them, who write about it, they do write about this being a very similar thing, a very similar sensation, as well as other visuals having to do with the third eye and things of that nature. So my theory right now, and it's just a theory, is that I think that human beings get used to being in a particular way, and it could be a very unhealthy way, at which point a lot of them would drop dead. it could be a way in which they start to thrive and live a good life, but maybe that's not the be-all, end-all either. Maybe that's just the phase that they were in that they got used to, but there are certain other things that they fail to explore, that they fail to achieve, which is why I personally don't see the life that we're in right now. I don't see it as being horrible at all. I don't have a rejection of the physical body. I think the physical body is in a way made in the image of God. I see that when just looking at any face, I see it as different from an animal's face. I see the human face as having something very, very special to it, even in the...
Well, maybe you should read Levinas. I mean, that's...
that sounds like Levinas, yeah.
Levinas. Okay, number one, I'm curious who Levinas is, but number two, just to finish off this little rant here, when you're talking about the transhumanist rejection of the physical to the... you could even say to the spiritual. Well, no, most transhumanists, I wouldn't say go that direction. I would say that they do want to put their body on a computer. I don't. I see, just as an example, and this may be a bad one, but imagine you have a deflated balloon and you poke your finger through it and somebody else pokes their finger through it. And this is the world that they're interacting in, through this sheath of this balloon. This is at least how I see the reality that we're in right now, where there's other things that are beyond this balloon that we're interacting through. But I think it is possible for us to not reject this body, but to do certain things to make improvements on the body. And then maybe the body that we're in right now is just one phase, kind of like when you're a kid, you're weaker, your head is bigger, you have less hair, and then eventually you have more hair. So there's a whole change that's going on. I don't think the change is limited specifically to where we are right now on this planet. And I love this planet. I think it's a great planet, but just the sheer amount of things out there makes me seriously doubt that this is the be-all, end-all of this whole experience.
Well, I think the argument is, Lev, that you experience those transformations through your body, and if you were to inhabit another form of bodily cognition or existence, that it wouldn't translate to your experience that you have now as a human being. But I don't know, Tyler, is that the argument? Or
Yeah, that's...
So what about like Lev's
fine.
transcendental sort of... Yeah, if you were to critique...
Here's the thing, though. Like, an account of what embodied cognition gives you isn't going to answer ethical questions about what kind of limits we should put on human development or what we can expect in the future. That, again, is a problem of secular reasoning. You need a kind of religious background to be able to answer these questions. Because if you start with a secular presupposition, then you basically end up with two answers, utilitarianism or deontology, right? Part of the problem with the secular is we don't actually have a way, if you're secular, to answer what Lev is getting at. Right? There's no distinction between what is the common good, what is right and wrong, what should we suppose. It's essentially a kind of endless growth, but doesn't really have much of a vision. It's almost like a cancer. The good never stopped ending. It depends on the way in which you look at it. But there's no way within a secular world, even just embodied cognition, to say this is what you should or shouldn't do. Embodied cognition gives you information about how it is that we have the perceptions we do, how consciousness develops, the influences and the impacts of, say, pursuing transhumanism. But I mean, like, if we take a look at like some elitist, what's that dumbass, Kurt Doolittle, he usually goes off about like how we need to, like, it's okay if all these other people poor people get genocided just as long as this elite become transhuman. It's a very utilitarian kind of view. It's a view that...
Did Kurt Doolittle say that?
Well, we had somebody like that on BTR, if you remember, Gio. What was that organization?
On Davos?
Yeah. So there was a bit of a vibe of that coming from the gentleman.
If we had Kurt Doolittle on, though, that'd be fun.
Oh, man, that would be pretty fun. But no, I agree with you, Tyler. There are people out there who only see things through this lens. But I don't think one thing excludes the other one if we're talking about one thing being the idea of there being an objective morality, and the second thing being there being many more levels to get to in this reality that we're in. And one of the other things that lead me in that direction, other than my own personal experiences, is if I think of somebody that was born... with some debilitating condition, God forbid, or some, mental issues, it's hard for me to imagine that for that embodied soul That's it. Those are the cards that you were given, and that is all to your experience within this particular realm.
That was like something I was. You go ahead.
No, that's pretty much it. I have a hard problem swallowing the God pill. Well, the Jesus pill, to be fair, not the God pill. If God.
But also, do you think,
yeah.
Tyler, that sort of like Merleau-Ponty's decadent French atheism sort of puts a monkey wrench in your dissertation, or no?
No. I mean, he just describes phenomenologically how the body, experience of the body with the world makes consciousness. It doesn't preclude one way or the other. I mean, phenomenology since Merleau-Ponty, you have what's called the religious turn phenomenology.
Mm-hmm.
Although even in the 20th century, it's kind of there as the Catholic Church that spread phenomenology. There's an interesting book about that, Catholicism and the Making of Continental Philosophy. But
oh my God, I have to buy this book. Holy crap.
yeah, you can't separate Catholicism. I mean, Dietrich von Hildebrand's wife just passed away, but they were surrounded. They literally were in Husserl's circle, right? They helped spread phenomenology. Pope John Paul II was a phenomenologist. That's where you get the theology of the body from. So it's not that, this is like a pure kind of atheism, right? Like the idea is that, and this is actually common of most, like even early Christianity, they talked about the soul as kind of like an inexplicable part of consciousness, right? It wasn't like a Descartesian flying thing that flies all over the place. You could separate it. It's not like a ghost in the machine. They had a dynamic, compounded view, whereas the soul and the body were essentially part of one process. The soul was more of like the animating principle, so to speak. And Aquinas picks this up quite a bit later with his own kind of compound dualism. But the idea like that you need a kind of, immaterial substance, kind of like in the Descartesian way, is much, much later. But again, the Christian point is that you have a view of an end time, which is bodily resurrection and glorification. It's based on the fact that bodily resurrection is essentially what will be your final destination. It's a restoration to glory. So it's like living this physical life without any kind of pain and always inhabiting glory, right? There's a fulfillment here of the limitations, and there's a sacramentalization of your everyday physical experience. It's not another world of reality, except heaven and purgatory are certain intermediate states. But these kind of questions, it's difficult because we're so used to thinking about it in a very modern way, like these kinds of apologetics, which have to imagine an immaterial substance rather than say animating principle. It's a problem of language. We're not used to really thinking that way.
No, but isn't it a problem of the embodied cognition you were mentioning earlier? If, let's say, we're talking about heaven or purgatory or hell, for that matter, any of these places would be otherworldly places, right? Like the body would be separated from the soul, and so there would be a different kind of cognition that you would experience within those particular realms. Or am I mistaken about that?
No, you're not. The thing with hell is hell actually isn't like another disembodied place either. Hell is a place of shame. It's separation from God. That would come in the eschatological vision where you would be bodily resurrected and you'd be in hell, right? But hell is, I think the best way to say it is like N.T. Wright says, hell is colluding with your own dehumanization.
Yeah, hell is participatory. That's the thing.
Yeah, it's so like even like the end time vision, the eschatological vision is still a bodily vision.
Yeah.
Now, okay, so wait, so that's okay. Yes, go on. Yes.
Right. This is somewhat a little bit more complicated because you look at like a lot of the magisterium of the church, they wrote about purgatory. They talk about it as if God is somehow holding like the animating principle, the soul that makes you what you are, even though you're not a full person without your body. In fact, the tradition within Catholic theology is that you're not a full person without your body. It needs to have the animating principle in your body, but your soul is essentially not quite what it is without the body either. It's a little obscure, but the people have speculated on it. But we do know that there isn't a view of the soul which is Cartesian, because the Cartesian view, the substance dualism view, is that you could, and this is what actually Christian apologists like Alvin Plantinga, they make these kinds of arguments all the time, that I can imagine my consciousness in a cricket, so I would persist in some other state after death. That is precisely what I'm denying. Is that that soul, the animating principle, is bound up with the body, and this is what the church has taught since most of its history, that you can't have, you're not yourself without the body.
But it's not an argument that, for example, when you look at Plato's the Phaedrus, for instance, where he's arguing with Stoics or with atomists that are saying that, well, your soul is within your body, and when your body dies, your soul dies as well. It's kind of like the creator and the clockmaker, blah, blah, blah. You're saying that there still is that transcendence, that life after death, but that soul wouldn't be as it is without that embodiment or your particular instantiation.
Here's the thing. This is part of the difference of the Christian vision of resurrection and post-mortem existence, essentially, is that in pagan mythology, Greek mythology, Roman mythology, the so-called dying and rising gods, which they're not dying and rising gods. This is what people say who haven't read any of the mythology themselves. But it's what you have is kind of like a regeneration into, say, like an underworld, right? It's linked into like agricultural spirits, so to speak. And that there's like a different kind of existence, which is not like the physical existence. It's like an existence in some, like you said, Hades or the underworld, it's a different kind of existence. The Christian view, on the other hand, is that it's this world, right? It's the Jesus who broke the bread. You could touch him, that Jesus. That resurrection is a resurrection of that body, right? So that's what I'm getting at. It is its own distinct view, and it was in some ways a little bit different from Second Temple Judaism, at least in terms of messianic expectations, but it was also very different from the Roman view. In fact, the Roman view, they found that completely repulsive, which is a mark against James Vallen's whole argument, because they despised this view of bodily resurrection. That would not have been something.
But what I don't get about the bodily resurrection is, okay, guide us through this process. So we have cells, we have the DNA, we have the gut microbes, which is not even a part of us. So when the resurrection actually happens, where do these things come from? How do they go together? What of the gut biome? Is there a gut biome? And all of that nitty gritty, like what exactly is going on there?
Well, I mean, the interesting is Origen actually had an interesting answer to this, which kind of prefigured modern science. He basically argued that none of your cells stay the same, and that if your body is already like that, you don't have the same set of cells that you started out with. Your body is constantly getting rid of new ones. Then it's not inconceivable that God could do the same process again. And again, like what kind of world would it be? I mean, like there's no way I could answer that. Like it's just the belief that I believe the Creator God could resurrect Jesus and could create the world, create the universe. I think he could figure this one out. Yeah, there's just no way I can answer that.
Well, no, it's funny because the process itself, how I imagine it, is that you wouldn't start out with a whole plant. You wouldn't just create a plant, although I guess theoretically, sure. But usually it would come from a seed, and then from that seed would start to come the sapling and so on and so forth. And with the human body, there is usually a certain process that ends up happening from the fetus onwards. If we're talking about the assemblage of a complete human from nothing for something to appear, that I find very fascinating because it touches on, at least for me, the idea of there being, beyond what we're used to in this physical reality, this interaction between the mental and the physical. If we're talking about the mind of God coming into being, certain things, snapping the finger right there, all of these various cells, and then all these cells and all these little things are configured in exactly the right way. It's a fascinating thing. I'm not exactly against it. I'm still not sure when it comes to the question of the embodiedness within purgatory, for example. Because hell, I get what you're saying, because if I'm going with you right now, hell would be your body is back together as it once was, but you feel this great sense of shame, this overwhelming sense of shame at the things that you did. Okay, good. Now that that's out of the way, purgatory. What exactly, just so we're clear, what exactly happens when you are in purgatory? And you mentioned that it's not really going to be the you because the body isn't there, but what is going to be there? That's the part that I'm curious about.
Yeah, that's a pretty hard question. I mean, like at least what we would affirm in church tradition, again, is that the soul persists, at least as an animating principle in purgatory, but you're not fully yourself without your body. But it's a part of the cleansing of who you are. essentially. Like, that's what it is. That's what the image of, like, burning in the fires of purgatory is you still have some leftover sin that's going to hamper you when you try to take a part of and partake in the glory of God, right? So the idea is that those stains on your soul are being removed, so that when you unite with your body, there's no kind of leftover wills heading in the other direction. I know it's hard to quite think about in our current understanding, but I do have to say one thing to the chat saying that none of this sounds so autistic, not down to earth. I mean, I have to laugh at that a little, though, because when you talk about the theology, I'm essentially saying it's a bodily vision, right? That's completely in the face of otherworldly way of thinking. But the whole point about embodied cognition is I'm actually saying that we can understand consciousness by understanding the physical world. That is the opposite of a not down to earth position. I mean, the neuroscientific, I want to say neuroscientific, neuromanic version of the way we understand consciousness is completely riddled with problems. But we are both a kind of physicalist view, actually. We're both physicalists in some way, but we're not a reductionist physicalist. We do have some room for other ways of thinking.
Like Daniel Dennett.
But if you're still adding this idea of this disembodied cognition, if again you are admitting the existence of something like purgatory where you would still be there, but it's not the you, I would say, like, if I were to be an asshole, I would say, who gives a shit? There's still going to be some you there. There's still going to be something that, there's still going to be something that I am seeing and that I am experiencing in this particular realm. Why are we just jumping over this? Why are we ignoring the implications of what that is? One other thing I throw into this, and again, because of time constraints during the week, I didn't have a chance to do this, but I want to compile for you and everybody else certain things that I found where in the emergency room where people go into this coma, they have been recorded after the fact talking about certain things that they know to certain people who were there, certain people who came and went, and this was during a period when they were clinically dead, a period when their brain did not appear to work, and I'm sure you've heard other instances of people talking about being separated from their body. I would also add to this the DMT experiences that people talk about, which they describe as being realer than reality itself. So all these things, plus the sheer unbelievable size of the cosmos as we know it today, just, again, like, I sometimes go and watch those videos where it shows the Earth is here, then the moon, then the sun compared to those, then so on and so forth, and your mind is just blown away by how big it all is. But anyway, I'm going on a slight detachment here. My point is that when it comes to this disembodied cognition, the things that I mentioned, the DMT and those experiences in the emergency room, what kind of picture do they paint to you as far as what exactly may be going on?
Well, that's quite a considerably more complex question, because we have to get into matters of brain science. But the first thing I'll say outright is when they argue for an embodied cognition view, and contrary to the person in the chat, it's not autistic cope. It's a view in cognitive science that has nothing to do with Christian theology. I'm just tying them together because Christian theology has the same view. It's a thing that you will find in biology of the brain. You'll find it in various kinds of philosophy departments, phenomenology. It's actually a radical view about how we understand consciousness. It's not even a theological discussion until we add the theology to it. But as we're not denying, say, for example, the role of the brain. I mean, I've heard people try to explain away experiences like near-death experiences, for example, as a kind of side effect of blood leaving the brain, and some kind of explanation that they give to go with that. I don't quite have a good explanation for that. Honestly, it's just not really a part of the thing I participate in, especially with DMT, right? Like, I tend to think those kinds of things are kind of playing with memories and imaginations that you already have internally inside you, and you're just kind of opening them. I don't think it's anything spiritual.
Unless two people experience the same thing at the same time and they're in different places. That would be the trump card for that particular argument, and I would want to see certain results there. Yeah,
that'd be interesting, yeah, but that's a bit beyond what I'm prepared to talk about today. But
yeah, no, that's a problem.
So Tyler, then, well, one is I'm I guess as a refresher, what did the Romans and the other pagans find so objectionable about the resurrection of Christ as opposed to a bodily resurrection? But also, do you, in your view, I guess, I mean, this is a basic question, but like, what happens at the time of death? Does the soul transmigrate, or is it rather in a point of stasis before the resurrection? Like, what happens?
So what was the first one again?
About what did the Romans and other pagans find so objectionable about Christ's version of resurrection, embodied resurrection?
Yeah, I mean, well, there's several different views that dominated Roman culture and several different civic cults. It depends on the one you're asking about. Like the Epicureans, for example, thought this was all there was. Gods existed, but they don't really care about us, and they don't intervene in the world. And when you die, you die. Right? That was the Epicurean.
Like pessimism, almost in some way.
Yeah, that was the Epicurean worldview. Another view was like the Platonic influence view that your soul went somewhere else. The commonality to every single one of them is any kind of bodily resurrection was considered to be absolutely disgusting. They didn't believe that. Like, look, a lot of people say this. Like, they say something stupid. Like, back then, people would have been not naive enough to believe in a physical resurrection. Like, what? You need a fucking doctor to come along and tell you people don't rise from the dead? The Romans didn't believe it. That wasn't their basis for post-mortem existence. Their basis was either the soul persisted somewhere else, it's Neoplatonic, or there was nothing at all. That was it.
Yeah.
Well, it's very also similar to the Jewish belief in at the end of days, there's going to be this particular rise. Yeah, there's going to be the rise of the people, and I think they're supposed to be buried in a particular place, the Mount of Olives or something like that. It's a very interesting thing. Again, to me, I'm not opposed to the idea of these things happening, but it almost seems like a stretch. Again, the last thing that I want to touch on.
What is the stretch, Lev?
Well, the stretch is that all of a sudden you're just reanimating bodies that are not on this world anymore, as opposed to leaving this particular world behind for those bodies and going to somewhere else. Why not? Why bring everything back to this particular... First of all, hold your horses. The most important thing. How many people are we talking here? How many people would be present at this point if we're talking about all the people that have ever lived in the world? I completely missed that whole part of it.
Oh, what happened in between the world?
No. If we're talking about people resurrecting... When Jesus comes back, people resurrect, right?
It'd be Soylent Green where people are everywhere.
How many people are we talking here? Like, isn't that just going to be like one person for every? I don't know. I mean, just.
You could fit most of the world's population in California. So, but aside from that, again, I just don't worry about these kinds of things because it's like if we actually believe that Jesus resurrected and these kinds of things, if we're believing in a creator God who created all this, then there's just no reason for me and my puny human brain to actually think about the logistics. It's just not a part of it.
I don't know. I find that, like, when you say that, I find that to almost be... Okay, the word cope is bad, but what it would remind me of is if you would have somebody in the Middle Ages who's saying that, well, I don't need to read original Hebrew or even understand what this person is saying in Latin. I'm just going to accept it because who am I? I'm just this puny human. That is the limitation that I find a bit disheartening.
I'm not making a comparable argument. I think, example, this is what I propose people do. One thing I always find funny is when I make claims about theology or the early church or what meanings of certain passages are, people will say, oh, well, you're just trying to make things more difficult to explain away difficult passages. No, it's because I understand that I'm reading an ancient historical text and I have to read it in that context, right? Now, like, is it cope? No, it's not cope, because the truth of the resurrection doesn't depend on me being able to explain scientifically how the creator God who created the universe would make that. What it actually depends on is whether or not Jesus resurrected, and if we have sufficient historical evidence for the reliability of the Gospels and the reliability of the promise of Jesus' return and the reliability of the resurrection, which, by the way, none of that we got into the whole debate, but We actually
But
do.
apparently,
I would love to have you
he
back,
resurrected
Tyler.
because he was an alien, and Giorgiani saw the
Yes,
tape.
yes,
The CIA
exactly.
has the tape of the
Yes.
alien resurrect, according to Jason Giorgiani.
No, Tyler. Here's the thing.
Oh.
Neil was supposed to come in today. Mondays are bad for Neil, as far as I understand. I would love for a Tuesday or a Thursday in the future. I would love to have you on and expand upon a lot of these things. I find them incredibly interesting as far as how do we know what we know, and it seems like there was just like an endless supply of things that we could get into here, and I'm really thankful that you were able to get into the things that you were today.
Yeah, well, in fact, I appreciate it. I'm a little sad he's not on because I wanted to take him to task for a couple of things.
Oh,
Like-
Neil would have been fireworks if he.
I know, like this dying and rising God thing. That's not even a category.
Okay, there is another thing. If I were to speak for Neil, which if he can possess me just for a second here, the dying and rising God. Okay, fine, let's get rid of that. What we still have though from the Old Testament and in general just the Jewish belief of cleanliness is blood, and this idea of consuming the blood of Christ, that would be, according to Neil, something completely antithetical to the Jewish faith at the time.
Yeah. So
I
Saint
don't know.
Irenaeus talks about this as well when it came to the Gnostics. Yeah, he said specifically about how. Let me go to the passage. This is from an essay.
Well, this is why he attributes it to the Romans specifically.
On the Eucharist, as mentioned
because,
with regard to St. Ignatius, the Gnostics logically rejected the Eucharist convention of bread and wine into body and blood, for they rejected true humanity of Christ. The Eucharist makes no sense if one rejects the humanity of Christ. Gnostic. In Book 5, Chapter 2, St. Irenaeus develops the theme of the Eucharist as nourishing us with the true body and blood of Christ, with the mediation of immortality. As in St. Ignatius, the Eucharistic conversion is clearly taken in a completely realistic sense. The doctrine transubstantiation clearly implied, but vain in every respect, as those who do despise the entire dispensation of God, disallow the salvation of the flesh, treat with contempt in resignation, maintaining that it is not capable of incorruption. Nor is the cup of the Eucharist the communion of his blood, nor the bread with we break the communion of his body. For blood can only come from vein and flesh. Whomever else makes a substance of man, such as the word of God would actually made. Therefore, the mingling cup of the manufactured bread receives the word of God. The Eucharist of the blood and body of Christ is made, from which things substance of our flesh is increased and supported. How they affirm the flesh is incapable of receiving the gift of God, which is eternal life, which is the flesh. So, in other words, the linchpin of the very foundation of resurrection, foundation of salvation, has to come from that, let's call it, enfleshed nature of Christ.
What does that have to do with Old Testament Judaism?
Well, that's because it's the final fulfillment of that covenant. It's the succession.
No, but it has nothing to do with it whatsoever before
what's
that.
Neil's argument? Why is this an
His argument came from Dionysus.
Yeah,
okay,
but flesh. No.
What are the? Because here's the thing. I know people. I know
totally
people have this vision. I know people have this vision of the Jewish people and hemoglobin today because of those particular fairy tales that the anti-Semites like to spread around. But
yes.
Yeah. But specifically, if we're talking about what is the connection?
It doesn't connect because because the enfleshed nature is carnality in Dionysus. It's the affirming of carnality. It's rather the wine that is some celebratory ecstasy of life. It is not life itself.
No, why are we? First of all, why are we talking about Dionysus? I mean,
because
okay,
that was Neil's argument.
Okay, no. Dionysus, that's fine. We could keep Dionysus, but my point has nothing to do with Dionysus.
Go ahead. Sorry.
My point is that there is nothing within the Jewish faith, the Hebrew faith, whatever you want to call it, where there is this consumption of
it's not kosher.
It's not kosher. It's absolutely not kosher. So that's why it seems like something that would have come from somewhere else without any connection at all to the original faith of Judaism, which is also why I find this angry, sadistic, as was talked about before by Miguel, God, to be something that is also antithetical to this other thing that came afterwards. It almost seems like you're trying to, I mean, I'm not saying you, but it almost seems like the end religion had, it's almost like a chimera. it has the back of a zebra and the front of a lion. It's just, there's something weird about this particular combination. And I understand that the point is, well, this is the fulfillment of that. If only there were things that had to do with the blood in Judaism, in the Old Testament Hebrew faith, then I could see a connection. But there isn't. And that's
This is
why
why we have to get rid of this Judeo-Christian nonsense right now. But, go ahead, Tyler.
Right. I mean, I don't see an issue here. The Christ is supposed to be the fulfillment of the covenant, the fulfillment of the story to Israel. But that still does contain, and to Lev's point, several things actually, which were not in the expectation of the Messianic Judaism, such as things like the partaking in the Eucharist. This was a part of Paul's hope, and also what Christ talks about. You have to take the body of that, and Paul affirms you have to take the Eucharist. A part of that is that because Christ resurrected, because Christ wants us to live out the kingdom of God in this world, that you're partaking of Christ, literally, not symbolically. And that's the foundation of the Christian community. That's the foundation of the church. It's sharing and participating in the lifeblood of the divine and sharing within our Lord. It's not exactly like straight out of Judaism, right? But it has no analog in Roman anything either. This is something I wanted to get to with Gnostic Informant. For example, he brought up Dionysus and he completely butchered it, and same with James. The fact of the matter is, you actually don't drink wine in a Dionysius ritual. You pour it out as a libation, as a part of a ritual of like modifying public consciousness, right? And there's no notion of being saved from sin in Dionysus either. In fact, you're saved from Pentheus' ire, where people get the notion that Dionysus, says you're saved from sin. And the people say you're saved from sin, comes from early 20th century history of religion school, where they believed in something called dying and rising gods. And they took that from James Fraser, the anthropologist. Now, it's a whole other thing I can get into, but the point is that at the time, when you find people referencing these kinds of stories about Dionysus, they're not in any of the Dionysus literature. They're in people that summarize Dionysian literature. And it's the same with any kind of Christ mythicism. If you're Arthur Drews in the 1920s, if you're History of Religion School, if you're G.A. Wells throughout the 20th century, if you're Tom Harper, if you're Peter Freck and Timothy Gundy and Peter Freck, the two New Age Gnostic feminists that wrote the Jesus Mysteries. If you're
oh god,
yeah,
we should get them on.
But here's the thing: Earl Doherty, you'll notice a pattern. They'll all reference these stories, and they'll all reference each other. And that material,
jerk.
The whole concept of dying and rising gods, once you elaborate and actually look to these stories like Mithraism, Tammuz, Adonis, Addis, whichever one you want to throw out there, they don't have these features. They're largely different from each other. The only scholars that try to keep dying and rising gods is in a very minimal sense, referring to like agriculture. It's not kept in a strong sense. In fact, they were basically trying to force Christianity onto these myths, because when James Fraser came up with that theory, he was actually basing his understanding on missionaries that were trying to understand these myths in other regions.
Various African religions as well that would have different poles of like the fire god temple. You would go if you were a head chief there.
It's also a part of a silly cope that a lot of Christians make, and I saw a lot of Christians make it in the live chat of that show. Was well, maybe like that's the Christ story is the real fulfillment of all these stories. They can all be the same, but when you break them down, Mithra, all that, they don't exemplify the same features, right? You don't need to engage in this weird mental gymnastics.
Yeah, but my point was not that. My point was that the Old Testament Judaism doesn't exemplify it either.
Yeah, but it exemplifies the fulfillment of the covenant,
right?
Based on the translation of the original Hebrew text, which is another thing that we definitely should get on with Gnostic Informant once we have that stream, because that's the other big thing that he was talking about, having to do with certain passages, the ones that are supposed to link up. Oh, shout out to Spot him, got him. Hope he's well. That are supposed to link up together the Old Testament with the New Testament. That they are not as they seem if you actually read them in the original Hebrew. And that's the other big thing. Yes.
He does?
He does. I saw it firsthand. He was looking through a book, and he was guiding me in it. And, he learned Hebrew. I think it took him about a year. I should learn Hebrew.
I'd be pretty immediately Yeah, maybe, but I'd be pretty immediately skeptical of that position. I mean, this is something, by the way, I didn't get into in the conversation. There's a whole lot I didn't get to actually respond to, but the notion of, for example, with comes the covenant, what you find in the earliest Christian communities, what you find in among the church fathers, is this affirmation of apostolic authority, which assumes the authority of the Old Testament. Right, because what they expected is what came along with the fulfillment of the covenant is new scripture and new apostolic authority. That goes back to AD 80. It goes back to the Didache and 100 AD, and then it continues all that way, all throughout up until the 4th century, and then we have the church, right? So there is a direct link. I would be very curious to see how he makes that argument, because that to me is just total nonsense.
I want to see that too. It is just interesting as an outsider looking in how little emphasis there was on Christians learning the Hebrew language.
Well, I mean, there's a lot of Old Testament scholars learn it. If you're people like me, though, we're required to learn Koine Greek. We're not really required to use that. If you do a PhD in theology, you have to, most instances, do 2 ancient languages. So most people. Oh
shit! Really?
Yeah, 2 plus 2. 2 fucking contemporary languages, but
you think, like, if you have the Old Testament in there, you think that the OG language, the Hebrew language, that would be definitely one to learn. You know, like, if you want the complete picture here, wouldn't that one be included in the list?
Well, it's not necessary, but it's one that they offer. The same with Greek; it's not necessary. It's one that they offer. It's if you're going into biblical studies in like Old Testament. Right, or if you're going into more early Judaism, then you'll have to do it. But if you're focusing more on like Koine Greek, yeah, you'll do that. But it's just simply the fact that you can't master everything, right? That's why, like, if you're talking about, textual criticism, this is something that's common with biblical studies as a whole. If someone would be an expert in textual criticism, another person would be an expert in ancient mythology, another person would be an expert in archaeology, another person would have like a more wider systematic theology.
I would say it's a bit different, though. For me, the analogy I would use, it's like learning to draw the arm and not knowing how to draw the body. If certain things, it's like when you're learning a language, not language, when you're learning the study of languages, right? Like, what is that called, the study of languages?
Philology.
Philology, yes. So when you're a philologist, you want to find the roots. And even if there are various branches that go in different directions, like, for example, unless you were a specialist, I wouldn't expect you to study, I don't know, Ethiopian Judaism, or I wouldn't expect you to study Mormonism. But I would expect anybody who is studying and who's devoting so much time to Christianity to look back in the original Hebrew at the Old Testament, at the Torah, and be able to compare those. I would say that is, you cannot get away from that, in my opinion. I think that is paramount.
Yeah, it's important, but like I said, people just have different specialties. Right? Someone who focuses on textual criticism isn't going to need to know Hebrew. If you're focused on textual criticism of like the Greek manuscripts, like that's one thing that I find difficult about these kinds of discussions, is because it's easy for someone like Miguel to say, scholars say XYZ, after I go through like 10 minutes explaining why we know for a fact the Gospels aren't anonymous, is because it leaves us in a position where we have to go through tons of specialized research. Right. So, like, for example, like the subject about like the reliability of the gospel transmissions, whether or not we know that the text is corrupted or has tons of variants. Right. We're dealing again with the 5,600 in Greek alone. And so there's a group of scholars who only focus on this. And there's others in other fields who only focus on it. And so you got to be able to have time to bring all these things together. Right.
Sure.
But what I am saying, though, is the case. Again, there's no historicity versus mythicism debate in academia. That's entirely online by people who just read other hacks. But it's not like it is. But like, again, you look at who they reference. I said earlier, they reference the same people that make the same arguments.
Sure.
But my point is we actually have a wealth of evidence, like the reliability of the Gospels, the dates, transmission. It just requires various various willingness to take hours to go through every special field, which is why, example, I didn't have time to go into why we know the canonical gospels are historically reliable, why we believe the empty tomb, which is a fact, why we know about the resurrection, like the various explanations that atheistic and agnostic scholars try to come up with to get around the resurrection.
Well, here's me.
He was only unconscious for a little bit, he had a coma, and then he came out.
My favorite explanation by a scholar to explain away the empty tomb was to say that Jesus had a twin brother that nobody knew about, and psychosis switched him in. And then that's one. I'm not even kidding. That's one of the explanations to get around.
One of my favorite comments tonight is up in the chat that says Mark Brahman is an expert in comic books. Fuck.
We should do a stream where we bring in Mark Brahman and like an Indian Brahmin. And an Indian
he
Brahmin.
Come on because of you, Lev. That's probably not going to happen.
Pussy. Okay.
Oh.
Bitch. Okay, hold on.
No, please. Not the Dionysian.
All right, wait. Hold on.
Sorry,
here's how I'm gonna cut. Here's how I'm gonna cut the Gordian knot here, because Tyler, you are presenting quite a Gordian knot when you're talking about all these scholars, scholar this, scholar that. I would argue that by going to the original Hebrew, you cut the Gordian knot. No scholars. You don't need scholars. All you need is to read the original language and to compare what it is said there in the original Hebrew to the closest text that we have today from like the Septuagint, for example. So that is something that I think would go beyond any scholars. I hate the fact that people have to reference scholars in order to back up their arguments. So I think that is actually the most clean-cut way of doing it. And I'm encouraging you to do that. And I would love to
do that. When my answer,
wait, you read Hebrew?
No, I'm saying I never said scholars say, other than a little note of it. Like my example on the Anonymity of the Gospels, I took explaining how ancient manuscripts, how scrolls worked, how they didn't have the titles on them, how the universal attribution, the fact that it's unlikely that they would have done. I gave all the arguments. I hate saying just scholars say, because most instances they're not reading scholars, they're reading people like Earl de Hurdy. The other case is that it's not helpful to the audience. If you want to know this information, you have to have it broken down. So often, like some people that chat are like, is Tyler reading this off notes? And it's like, yes, I have notes. No, I'm not looking at Google. I wrote about 30 pages of notes explaining all this information because it's a very complex field of inquiry. But we actually know a lot more about the historical Jesus than people think we do. And you wouldn't get it outside of a lot of these discussions. But as for Hebrew, when it comes to reading that, you kind of do need a little bit of scholarship, though, because there's also contextual things which go into it, matters of ancient understanding. So let me give you an example. Gnostic Informant, this wasn't about the Hebrew. This would have been Greek. But he mentioned the whole turn the other cheek and stuff like that, right? He mentioned that these are promoting a pacifism. Turn the other cheek, carry your bag an extra mile. This is where understanding historical context matters, that these are honor and shame cultures, right? They weren't individual guilt cultures, they're honor and shame cultures. So a part of the message of that, which is much wider in scope than what I'm about to present here, but this is where the social context matters, is turn the other cheek. When you slapped with that cheek, you were hitting with the back of your hand, which essentially meant that the person was an inferior. Right. So when you were told to turn the other cheek, they would have to hit you the other side of the hand, which you would use if somebody was.
Oh, the back action.
Yes. So this is, was a way of affirming your dignity to Roman power, because that is how they treated inferiors, like women, children, Jews, was by that. Right. Carry your bag an extra mile. Roman soldiers would often make Jews in Jerusalem and also in the diaspora carry their bag for 1 mile, like as a form of shame and humiliation. But what would you do if you carried that bag an extra mile? You would be humiliating the soldier, because it's implying he's too weak to do it on his own. And finally, someone takes your coat, give them all your clothes. That's referring to the Jewish court system, where the accused, if they're accused and they give up their coat, that's a sign of guilt. If you give up all your clothes, that's nakedness. And then that other person, the accuser, is the one who is acting shamefully and the one that should be accused. These are ways of asserting dignity. It's not pacifism. But this is my point, though. If we just simply read those texts, we wouldn't know that. This comes from understanding that time period and the way they thought. That's why. And
by giving them the clothes, so by giving him all your clothes, it's a way of shaming your accuser, because it's like, oh, look, you're taking everything from me. Is that what you're saying?
Let me think of it like an analogy. Say, for example, I'm out sharing chicken wings with somebody. We have like 20 chicken wings in the middle of us, and we divide them. I take 11. He takes, we're supposed to each take 10. I take one more than him. And he accuses me of taking one more than him. But then he takes all of the ones I have, which means he's the one being the thief, right? So that's the point. You're shaming the accuser by pointing out that they're the one who's actually unjustly taking you to court. And like, this is the thing, like this doofus in the chat, this is next level apologetic cope. No, you're reading ancient literature from the first century. They don't think like people in comment section.
They didn't have Giga-Chad and Wojak back then.
And again, right, you have to be able to understand you're reading at something from a different time period. Right, you didn't think the same way, but now it's a pro-Jewish or pro-Roman. It's neither. As I said before, when you're saying like Christ takes on the handle of Son of God, he's affirming himself over and above Caesar. That is not a pro-Roman message. So, is it pro-Jewish? No, it's again. There's also persecution.
Wait, say that message again, just so I'm aware. What is the specific message where Jesus ends up being higher than Caesar? What is the specific?
Well, it's
the term Son of God. When Paul refers him as the Son of God, and Christ refers himself as Son of God, Paul going into Rome and saying that this is the Son of God is saying to the imperial Caesar cult that you are not divine, that this person is higher than you. That is a massive insult. That's not subservience.
Okay, so Son of God, that, and again, I'm a bit slow here. This is not my forte for now. It will be soon, thanks to you. But it would be from the writings of Paul where that would first appear, Son of God, right? And what year again would that appear, this Son of God, regarding Caesar?
Generally, I guess like the consensus is the Pauline letters, and I agree, are before the canonical Gospels, yeah.
So around what AD?
Like 50, 40.
Okay, interesting.
Like, there's lots of technical stuff about dating.
Yeah.
We were taking
okay. One thing that I would just to get us out of the weeds here. One thing that I could focus on is, let's say, if out of those first three things you said, I would pick the one about the clothes, and I would say, okay, Tyler Hamilton gave a very interesting interpretation of the clothes bit. How do I know that Tyler is correct about this? What do I do now?
Well, what you do now is you go look to my sources. I have Walter Wink, who's a biblical scholar who actually did a lot of work about this. Same with Richard Hayes, who's one of the most premier biblical scholars around right now. So him and Richard Hayes, N.T. Wright talks about this. There's also social science commentaries on biblical history and the gospel. They're not written by Christians. They're just written by Hellenistic social commentators.
But out of all of those, if you were to pick one thing that you recall right now, and if not, that's fine, that we could move on. But if you could recall when you were reading these scholars, how exactly did they go about finding out that this, like whether it's turn the other cheek or about the clothes, that this was what they meant as opposed to what people now think it meant?
Yeah, I'd recommend reading Walter Wink's because his is actually the most straightforward. It's the most accessible without having to have a bunch of background knowledge. But his is the most, I would say, the easiest one because he refers to a lot of punishment on behalf of like Romans would inflict on Jews, and he goes to primary texts and Roman historians and Jewish historians, and there's also archaeological evidence about this as well. Like, it's the same thing how we know about Hellenized. Judaism isn't really that Hellenized as people think it is, because we have, for example, coins in Jerusalem which aren't minted with the emperor on them, which implies that they're more socially conservative when it comes to their Judaic identity. Right, so there's tons of things about this. But yeah, I'd recommend that. As someone in the chat says, Walter Wink, he tries to argue in favor of homosexuality. I know, that's why I picked him, because I don't want it to look like I'm being too partisan here. Right?
Yeah, he's a libtard, so then, yeah.
Like what people say often, skeptics, is you'll say, oh, you're just referring to people that agree with you, just Christian biblical scholars. No, I could do this with Bart Ehrman. I could do it with Marcus Borg. You could do it with John Dominic Cross.
By the way, that's a very, if you don't mind me saying, very fabulous name, Walter Wink. Right? It's a very...
Someone said in the chat way in the beginning that even Bert Ehrman the premier Jesus denier for reasons of identity. He even accepts the historicity of the four canonical gospels. So
like I said before, there's no historical Jesus debate. What people debate about is
if he was the Son of God,
like which sayings are reliable, whether or not resurrection has happened. They'll usually pick other things. What the meaning of Christ's mission was. There's different interpretation, but the historical question, whether or not Jesus is never one of the questions. Yes, Walter Twink. I actually disagree with Walter Wink on a lot of things, though. Again, showing I'm not being partisan. He puts pacifism back into Christianity, like in the time of the Church Fathers. But I don't agree, because if you read them, they're actually talking about the fact that being in the Roman army meant you had to swear allegiance to a certain god. So you read like Tertullian and all them, they're actually saying you're guilty of idolatry if you participate, right? There's none. And of course, Jesus and the centurion and all the like. You
had to swear allegiance to the Roman Emperor.
I agree with him about a lot of things too, but we can know these things.
Wait, but that's okay.
You had to swear allegiance to the Roman Emperor, though, if you're a centurion there. Yeah.
Yeah, that was the issue. It wasn't over in the Church Fathers, anyways. I'm not saying this is the whole pacifism question. I'm just
Roman belief in gods was also ambiguous, was it not? Like a lot of them kind of were proto-atheists, and
some of them were fedoras. I mean, some of the early writers actually said things like these gods are just like mythological versions of things we can't explain. Right?
Like modern far-right pagans nowadays, they don't actually believe it. It's just like a will to power sort of thing.
Like again, Epicurus, he said the gods have nothing to do with the world, so you might as well just enjoy your life. There are atheists, right?
Deists, if we're talking about like the founding fathers, for example, and they were very into Roman architecture as well. Yeah. But that is like a separate thing. Okay, one thing.
Freemasons.
One last thing.
A lot of things.
Well, one thing that I wanted to touch on though is when it comes to the pacifism angle. At a certain point, though, you would say that the church embraced this particular idea of turn the other cheek being what we're used to. What was that point when that was what turned the other cheek? Never.
You know what the theory, the doctrine is in Catholicism? It's not a theory. It's a doctrine. It's just war doctrine. The magisterium has never affirmed full pacifism.
Like Quakers.
People that do, by the way, are Anabaptists. Right, but they're much later, right? So Anabaptists, Mennonites, but these are we're talking like 18th century arguments. There is somewhat right now a bit of a renaissance of sorts for it because of people like Stanley Hauerwas, who was an Anabaptist, and he started teaching at Notre Dame, which is a Catholic university. And he started promoting a lot of Christian pacifism. In his case, I could actually kind of understand why. I mean. Yeah,
but what about martyrdom, though? If we're talking about some of the Christian martyrs of the day, and again, I'm not as familiar with what exactly transpired there in the Roman Empire with the martyrs, but isn't that the idea that these were not people of a zealous nature like Saul? These are not people that would, try to assassinate the Roman emperor or whatever. These are people that would have their faith and would die for their faith. And isn't there something pacifistic about that?
No, the distinction we're not making here is that the understanding in Christian theology is you don't kill to impose Jesus. That is the position of the magisterium. By the way, I know in history it's happened. That's a non-point. The theological position of the magisterium is you don't kill to, bring people to believe in Jesus, because one, it's on actual conversion. The other is that Christ is a suffering God. That's the whole basis of our faith. Yeah. But that does not say anything about, for example, self-defense. Doesn't say anything about what is a just reason to go to war, especially because in some instances, now I know this is hard to talk about today because so much of war is not just at all, and we have to deal with scale. This is a whole other question, by the way, about scale and modern weaponry and all these.
It was never really just, if we're talking about all those religious wars that you said yourself was not based on the religion as it was based on certain party politics, right?
So certain crusades were definitely justified, Lev. I mean, come on.
Right, but I do want to finish my point here.
Yes, go on.
The point is like it's just not that clear cut. Like a lot of the Christian thinking on the subject is, if Geo's being attacked and I'm in a position in which I can do something, am I loving him if I don't intervene? right? It's the same thing they apply to just war and war around the world, that there are legitimate reasons based on love about why you should do something, which is actually, again, a counter to the world of domination and imperial venturing for the sake of it. This is, again,
will to power, might makes right.
But was this something that was shown with the early Christian martyrs? That's my primary question here. What exactly were the martyrs doing as a response to the Roman persecution?
Another thing, Lev, is it wasn't like it's not like you're trying to gamify your own sainthood by seeking martyrdom. Martyrdom happened. It's not like you're trying to willfully. I mean, you accept.
Well, I mean, look at certain organizations in the Middle East as recently. You know, they're definitely seeking out martyrdom.
No, but there's also laws against. I can't say. Can I say suicide and you checking out? Anti-heroing.
Buying the farm.
There's also laws. There's orthodox doctrines against anti-heroing.
No, but isn't martyrdom kind of a loophole though? Because when you put yourself in a position,
it's not like you go and seek martyrdom for the greater good. It's not like you're going to It's not like an adventure seeker. It's not like a parkour person seeking the thrill of.
But why does that? What does that matter? I mean, I don't know the motivation of people who seek martyrdom, but there are some people who seek martyrdom.
You know how in Orthodoxy, there's like the sort of the doctrine that you can't exactly find any sort of particular gnosis, and you go and seek out God's grace. Grace has to be open to you by God. It's like that. It's like you don't. It's kind of like Zen, you know. If you try to find Zen, you're not going to find it. It's like
but that's not going to stop people from finding it. That's not going to stop people from going on the quest.
Here,
go ahead,
Lev does have a point. There is lots of people who deliberately seek out martyrdom. A lot of early accounts, because it's like a great witness to the suffering of Christ, that you yourself suffer like him because you're supposed to be like Christ. That does happen, but at the same time, a lot of the early martyrdom accounts that are like that is a lot of people who are, for example, some Christians like Pliny and others report them as like not defending themselves, and some people also deny it. He also reports Christians that are being persecuted that actually stop their faith and they get too scared about it. But you do find a lot of early martyrdom accounts that are actually being caught up in a zeal, in the sense that, if they're persecuting my brothers, I'm going to seek out martyrdom as well. Right. So there's a certain sense of witness to this. So Lev isn't entirely wrong. But again, the distinction between martyrdom and self-defense and just war is on two completely different things.
No, but it is interesting, though, because you mentioned right now that when my brother is being martyred, I'm not going to go and, take a bat to the head of the people who are killing him. I'm going to martyr myself. So why is it that there's no Saul-like retributionary mechanism within Christianity? Wouldn't that apply that there is some pacifism going on here as far as your response to the world around you?
Well, I think in those early martyrdom accounts, they simply didn't have the means to defend themselves, even if they wanted to. So I think they gleefully went and made an example when their own brothers were martyred, that they're like, we're not scared of imperial power. We'll also take it up on ourselves. Right. So there's a thing of context here. But once it's a different story, once you're actually in power, and all of a sudden you have to deal with the questions of like, how do we approach nations that are hostile? How do we approach these kinds of things? They ask two different questions is what I'm getting at. Someone answered asked in the chat, Tyler, where is the part of the Bible that promotes just war theory? Look, I'm not a Protestant, right? We don't have sola scriptura. That's nonsense, sola scriptura.
Wait, what is sola scriptura?
Scripture
by doctrine alone.
Scripture alone. If it's not in the Bible, it's a self-contradictory.
Well, if it ain't in the Bible, son.
But the point is like what you have accepted, that there is some hints about like war and the like, about why you would go to it. But the point is, a lot of things in the Bible aren't actually present to help us answer. You have to take the foundations of what it means to be a Christian and what kind of doctrines we have, and then you reason from them. The tradition has always been in that. That's why in the 2nd century, for example, they take up a lot of Neoplatonism. It's not because they believe in like a Gnostic flight from the world. It's because, like, for example, Justin Martyr, he reasons, okay, how do we understand this Trinity thing? Well, look, these pagans have an interesting idea about about like the way they think about the parts of the soul, for example. So they think, okay, well, this could help us interpret it, right? The metaphysics of the one that you find in Neoplatonism. Yeah. It's not that they stop believing in the Trinity, what makes it unique. It's not that they stop believing in the particular eschatological vision they have. It's just that, you have to reason about these things, and you, to an extent, have a natural theology, right? That you accept that you live in a God-created world, so people, by their reason, can understand it without reference to revealed theology. But you can't understand all of it.
Mm.
Yeah, well, Michael in the chat has a good point about Saint Paul says, like, you don't actively go out seeking trouble. It's like, dust your sandals off. There's sort of an equanimity to the Christian life where you fight for what is just, but at the same time you don't go and like bloodthirstily seek sort of vanquish like the empire does. Like, the Rome is like as a metaphor for empire. It's sort of like yeah.
The interesting thing is that Christianity is very much a scandal, whether you're on the political left or the right.
Yeah.
If you're on the left, the chat would be completely different. These people would be saying like, oh, this thing that oppresses women and sexual minorities and all these stuff.
And this chat is like, yay, oppressing women.
And this one is like, well,
you're cooked.
You're a cuck. That's the point. Is its own worldview that you have to understand the uniqueness of.
Is it a third position, Tyler?
Yeah, it's third position.
Well, I do have a final question, which is, once the church actually got going and got into the position where the all-too-human element comes out from the leaders who, like you were mentioning, if we were to take this view that it was not the church, it was the kings and the nobility with their territorial disputes who were the ones that were instigating a lot of this conflict using religion as an excuse. What I'm curious about is when this was going on, whether, let's say, for example, we're talking about the Protestants versus the Catholics. When that was going on, what was the response from some of the church leaders, like the prominent church leaders? Were there any negative responses saying like, no, stop this is absolutely wrong, why are you killing each other, we're all Christians here, let them do their thing and we'll do our thing and we'll be good like that? Has there been any response from the prominent church leaders of the day when all these wars were going on of that ilk?
I mean, there is like because we're talking about 16th century. There is some instances in which bishops do support the wars entirely, largely because they have benefactors that are the same patrons that are largely causing these wars. But there's
Fascist Italy.
Yeah, but I mean there's also instances. You can't have a one-way record about these things. There's also people who, even with World War II, were calling an end to the violence, saying this is not the Christian way to be. You have persecution of like Christian priests and bishops during this time. You have it, Catholic in particular. You have it the other way around, Protestant pastors, right? It's the same with the confessing church in Germany in World War II. They had those who, like Dietrich Bonhoeffer, were in a plot to kill Hitler, and you had those who were part of the national church. Interestingly enough, a big part of German critical biblical scholarship in that time period is largely trying to get rid of the Jewishness outside of Christianity. So they put that to use. But
Falange, Spain is famous for its relation between the Catholic Church and the regime. Same with Eustachi and
Franco as well. Oh Franco, yeah.
But also, like, for example, during the Civil War in America, you had Catholic churches that would treat the sick and the wounded equally. So you'd have like Union and Confederate soldiers in the same infirmary in the church, which is kind of crazy, but
Well, that's nice.
Yeah.
All right, so guys, I think we got to go right now. It is already 10:22. We've been on this for a very long time, but I really appreciate, Tyler, you taking the time to speak with us about all these things, and also a big shout out to Miguel Conner. Thank you so much, Miguel, for coming in here, having this nice little debate here. I think we've touched on a lot of different things, but guys, this is just the beginning of the BTR Holy War. It has just started right now. Yes. Well, we are going to have a very interesting event coming up tomorrow, which I'm going to plug right now. It has nothing to do with any of the things.
Go ahead.
It has nothing to do with any of the things that we were talking about right now. But even before that, I want to shout out some good news. The good news being that the chat thing works. So if you notice in the bottom, right now, the new temporary maybe king of the chat is the ABC 123456399, $19. So if any of you wants to beat him and become king of the chat, you gotta throw in more smackaroos than that. But also, I want to plan something special for at the end of the month, because this is basically monthly. Basically, like the people who you see here, they are the month's worth of the super chat donators. So I want to figure out something special that we'll do for every month. The official winner of the king of the chat, whoever remains on top, whoever is the king of the hill of the super chats at the end of the month, we're going to do something special for them. So it's on. Anyway,
so SCS says thank you, Tyler. Come back. Yes, Tyler will be coming back.
Yes, absolutely. So, and here we have. Okay, so this is the event right over here. Angel Eduardo of the Affair Foundation Against Intolerance and Racism. He's coming in with
but I'm for intolerance.
With Joshua Lakash. A lot of pictures of Joshua with Paris Hilton, by the way. I didn't know that. I guess they're friends. And the subject is, can and should liberalism be saved? That is what I love. No. My favorite part of this is looking at Gio whenever I'm saying this. So,
well, apparently because I'm pro the convoy, I'm a libtard, because most people in the convoy believe in rights.
Yeah.
So
and by the way, yes, it can be for those who are asking, it can be queen of the chat as well. It's gender neutral, so you can become
someone
queen
in
of the
chat
chat.
said that my sole purpose for BTR is to ward off women. So that's
Yeah, well, I got to take a look at the stats of how many women watch BTR. But anyway, that is coming up. And also another thing I want to do, by the way, is I want to have, and I already made the icons, I want to have icons for patrons. My question, and this is like a question for all the patrons who are here, would you be comfortable having your names displayed on the screen? Because I know people go about it in a different way. I know that there are creators who have the whole list of patrons that they display at the end of their videos, and I figure hey, they're not asking every single patron if they're comfortable with that. So I'm curious what the dynamics are here. This is still something I'm exploring, but I hope you guys like this new ticker at the bottom, and it does work, and you see yourself in it when you put in the certain amount of money. So anyway, that being said...
also, I wanted to organize, if you saw on Twitter, I wanted to organize a discussion between Apex and William, who had that excellent tweet about bringing back the home farming to solve the food shortage crisis, and he had a bunch of terrible blue ticks going after him. He is also a Substack writer with Apex, so I wonder if we can make that happen. He's down to do it. He said that, so yeah.
That would be quite interesting. And I'm also planning to do a stream with the, I think it may be with Styx as well, but the other person is the guy who wrote the article talking about how it's okay if we have an authoritarian response to climate change. Do you remember that article, Gio? Ross Matiga. In Cambridge University. That was where the article came
Cambridge. Oh, man.
So that's going to be very interesting. Damn. But anyway, I don't want to keep Tyler. I want to end this right now. And any final... Well, patreon.com/breaktherules. What more is there to say? If you've been watching this, you were seeing the top of the screen, which is also new. By the way, let me know what you think about the fire backdrop, the one with the changing into fire right now.
I think if you were to take the original purple neon color scheme and put it with the new logo, that'd be kind of fun. That'd be
better. Okay. Yeah. Guys,
so Tyler, shill your...
Wait. Right before the shill. Press 1 if you like this fire pattern. Press 2 if you want the old pattern back, superimposed instead of the fire pattern. Go. Okay, and now Tyler, shill time.
Where can we find you? Where can we support you? We got to get Joel Davis back on, but he only has this Telegram, so it's hard to direct DM him. But I'll try to find.
Joel does EBL with me every now and then. We've been streaming together for a year and a half now. But if you want to find my stuff, go find YouTube. It's Thamster. It's also on Odyssey. It's also on audio formats and all that kind of stuff where we go over these kinds of questions. So right now we're going through, where are we now? With the Nouveau Theology movement of the 20th century and the political theology, people like Blondel and de Lubac and all those guys. So lots of stuff on there, but pretty wide actually array of content, philosophy, theology, that kind of stuff. And you can find me on Twitter, Tyler Thammy.
Excellent. And one final thing I want to say.
Oh, you have a Ko-Fi, right? Yeah.
Oh, what is a Ko-Fi?
I don't really use it too much. On my Twitter, Tyler Thammy, there's a link tree on there. It'll just show you all the
So if you want to monetarily support Tyler in his work, then you can do that.
Oh, I see you have a coin tree. You know, the Break the Rules also has a coin tree, but for some reason I never promote it. And it's not even on the screen anymore. It used to be where the ticker is now, and now I got rid of it. Maybe I'll bring it back, but I don't know. You guys could find it in the description of the video. There, it's in every video. So the coin tree, send BTR some crypto. I'll appreciate it. So I don't know. I see a lot more 2s than 1s. I see a couple of 1s, but So Rook likes the fire. This fire, it's from the stove in my backyard. There's with the fire coming out. It was a nice video. Anyway, patreon.com/breaktherules. Listen, guys. I'm speaking to you right now, face to face, eyes to eyes. Look at my eyes. Look how serious I am about you needing to become a patron right now, and you are going to get a lot of goodies. First of all, I want to put you on the screen as well. Press 1 if you want to be on the ticker. Press 2 if that's an invasion of privacy. That's another one. No. Press 2. No, press 3 if you. God, I don't want to get them confused. Press 3 if you want to be in the ticker. Press 4 if you think it's an invasion of your privacy. So there we go. But $10 patrons. What am I talking about? $5 patrons. $5 patrons are going to get the MP3 episodes of the Break the Rules stream after they come out. You are also going to get the ability, and I rarely broadcast this, the ability to write in this Discord chat over here, so you could actually post images and links and all that fun stuff within reason, of course. Don't post pornography.
Yeah, we screen the images to make sure they don't come up.
No, we don't. No, we don't.
Fuck.
It's impossible to. So that's why I'm just saying this is for the patrons. So just put in the images, and we'll trust you. We'll see who it is, by the way, who's putting in the naughty stuff. So we'll, bad boy, whoever's doing that. Anyway, listen, $5 is going to give you all of that. $20 is going to give you very beautiful magnets from my father, Alexander Polyakov. Here, let me see if I can switch the camera. Funny, when I switch to Lev camera, it doesn't display the camera, but is it going to display? Hold on, I'm probably looking at a different thing. Listen, guys, you're going to have to bear with me here. I'm still learning how a lot of these camera things work, because what I want to do is I want to display the magnets on the screen so you guys could see them, but I'm probably just going to have to throw them in the Discord, which is fine. Let me throw them in the Discord right now. For those who don't know, my father, Alexander Polyakov, is an incredibly talented artist. He is one of a kind. And if you guys want to contribute to Break the Rules, but also get something real pretty, take a look at these magnets right here. Look at that. And they're loading, and you're going to see them just in a bit. And I guarantee, there we go. Look at these magnets. Aren't they nice? Here, I'm going to put them on the big screen for you guys to look at. Seriously, though, it should have worked what I want to do with the big screen. But anyway, here are the magnets. You see them. I want to try, just out of curiosity, to put them on the Lev cam. But there we go. Now it's over here. You can see the magnets. Look how beautiful that looks. And here is the Styx Dragon. This is the almighty Styx Dragon. If you guys are fans of Styx, you can get him for $50. But also, for $30, you are going to get the beautiful, exquisite Giovanni Pennacchietti prints from the TFW No GF series. You could see him in action here doing it. So that's $30. And $50, you can either get the Styx Dragon, or you guys can get a custom magnet, whatever design you want it to be. It shall be, within reason, it shall be done. And I guarantee you, These are great magnets. And also, people are saying press 7 if you think Tyler won. Well, then I'd say press 6 if you think Miguel won. So let's see. Or I don't know. People are picking all kinds of numbers right now. I don't know what's going on.
Well,
Listen,
you confused the hell out of them.
Patreon.com.
Probably why.
Patreon.com/breaktherules. Become a patron today. And I guarantee you not regret it, because what is being built right now is something real special. Getting all these people together talking. I'm having the people from Fair on. We are going to be changing the game. So we're changing the game together
after this, you have to let me book a hardcore far-right extremist. We have to book Thomas 77 after this, Lev. You have to give me that.
Only after I have Thomas 666 on. All right, so...
I am a right-wing extremist. You just didn't ask me about my politics.
Oh, you seem like I don't know.
What are we having Thursday, Lev?
Dude, the question of integralism. We didn't even.
I know. We could do a whole stream just on integral. Oh my God! Can you imagine if we landed Adrian Vermeule and we put him up against far right, like someone, I don't know. That'd be pretty fucking.
Wait, who's Adrian Vermeule?
That sounds like the Harvard integralist. We could get Patrick Deneen. That would be fun if we got Patrick Deneen.
Well, my policy, once again, is I want to bring on people who are on the right and people who are liberals together. That's pretty much my goal.
Well, he wrote the book, Why Liberalism Failed. He's at, not Harvard.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, I got a reminder.
Patrick Deneen.
I got a reminder to read the Sneeds, read the Super Chat. So here we go. This is the final thing. Thank you. Who said that? The ABC. See, this is why ABC is king of the chat, because he remembers things that I forget. He's like an extension of my brain. So here we go. Okay, here we are. Okay, the Prudentialist, $10. Lev is king of the grift. Here's to a good debate. Thank you so much, Prudentialist. ABC, $5. God is a Man of War. Book by Stephen DeYoung. Read it, Geo, because the debased ones won't. Also waiting on based reading list.
Oh.
Here we go. I mean, speaking of reading list, like look at all these books that I have over here. Look, here's the Napoleon book.
Oh shit, it's real? I thought that was your green screen, Lev.
You know what I like? You know what I like about this book? Look at this cover. See, it's like half of his face, and then like the full face over here. So if you put it on the side, you can see the full face.
Oh man.
Let's see what else we have here. Ooh, look at this. Bloodlands. Europe between Hitler and Stalin. That's a good one. Let's see. I have Homer, Iliad, and the Odyssey over here. Let's see what else.
Someone mentioned Carlsbad. Can you imagine Deneen versus Carlsbad? That'd be fucking.
See, great. I got the Holy Bible. See, I got the Bible. Let's see.
All right, Lev, just go on with the super chats, please.
And next to the Bible,
I have to go eat half my dinner.
Next to the Bible, I have the complete works of William Shakespeare, aka what was the guy's name? The guy who's supposedly William Shakespeare.
The black guy?
No, not the black guy. What's his name? Something Ham. Hold on. Oh God, you know who I'm talking about? The guy who's supposedly. No. There's the person who people suspect was William Shakespeare. That William Shakespeare was just a name for it. Let's see. Oh man, what is wrong with me? Who was William? Shit. Thank you, Divine. Francis Bacon. It's just like shot out of my mind. So I was just about to say, complete works of Shakespeare, allegedly written by Sir Francis Bacon, who was allegedly the writer of the King James Bible. Look into it. It doesn't mean that the King James Bible was... It doesn't mean that the Bible was written by him. What it means is that the way that he wrote it, stylistically, is very similar to the Shakespearean tone. There were not a lot of people at those times who would do something like that, and supposedly he put some Masonic, esoteric stuff in there as far as how he had certain verses. So that's an interesting rabbit hole to get into. But anyway, we are ending the stream. I see more people saying Francis Bacon. Again, the extension of my mind. Final super chats. ABC $2. Hey, a Bears fan. He's all right. Another ABC. For $7. I just want to highlight what Philip said. Gnosticism is pre-industrial transhumanism. Again, I would just differ. You know me, my ideas. I think we're all on this journey towards yada yada. You get the hippie shit. Anyway, Joshua Larson, $2, and also Mr. Doxology, $6. No comment. I really appreciate this and everything here. We even got a follower on Twitch. We are on Twitch, by the way.
He was getting roasted in the chat. I feel bad for him. He donated.
Well, I really appreciate him donating, and I really appreciate everybody watching. This has been a great stream, as always. Thursday, we are going to have I guess it's kind of BTR Holy War, but it's kind of BTR Holy War Light. Or will it? We are going to have on Max Derritt, and we are also going to have on, let's see, Gnostic Informant is going to be back for that one because it's going to be a Thursday, so he'll be able to attend. And we're going to have Andrew Meyer back on talking about the Kabbalah, and we are going to relate all of these, like the Kabbalah and mysticism and Gnosticism and all that stuff, to video games and how video games may depict.
I might have to
certain
skip that
occult.
one.
God damn it, Gio! You gotta like being uncomfortable for a bit. I think you'll enjoy that. You play video games, right?
No, I'm not.
You're a gamer.
I haven't played a video game.
Gamers rise up.
2011.
Gamers rise up. Anyway, listen, guys, this is a great stream. Tyler, I really appreciate you being here. I have no idea, by the way, what your politics are, but you're a nice guy, so I'm sure if there's any problems there, it's only temporary and you'll grow out of it. But who knows? I don't know. I don't know what your politics are.
That's the thing for the audience, by the way, is if you're going on my channel, what you're mostly going to find is theological critiques of liberalism and theological critiques of modernity. That's what you'll discover there.
Excellent.
There you go.
And with that being said, Tyler, I would love to have you back soon, specifically with Gnostic Informant. I'm going to show him the entire video, so he's going to have a chance to read through everything and consider it, and then we're going to... It's going to be a lot of fun. All right, guys. Mwah! Good night, everybody, and please subscribe. Keep subscribing. God bless. And goodbye.